In the late 1930s, as the world teetered on the brink of war, the quiet English countryside in Suffolk held secrets long buried beneath the earth. The land, rolling in green, had a gentle way of keeping its past concealed. But for Edith Pretty, the owner of Sutton Hoo Estate, the ancient burial mounds on her property stirred her curiosity. Edith was a wealthy widow in her 50s, and despite her age, she possessed an adventurous spirit. She had always been fascinated by history and archaeology. After years of living on the estate and gazing at the mounds, she began to wonder what lay beneath them. Her interest grew after hearing local legends that these mounds might hide long-lost treasures, perhaps even the resting place of kings. It was the summer of 1938 when Edith finally decided to act. She had been reading articles on recent archaeological digs and, inspired, she contacted the local Ipswich Museum for advice. They recommended Basil Brown, a self-taught archaeologist with a passion for unearthing history. Though not formally trained, Brown had a deep knowledge of the land and a reputation for careful, thorough work. Edith invited him to the estate, and soon an agreement was made to begin exploring the mysterious mounds. Basil Brown was not a man of wealth or high education, but he possessed a talent that few others did. A sense of the land. He had an ability to read the earth and understand its secrets. When he first set foot on Sutton Hoo, he was struck by the sheer size of the mounds. Some were as tall as trees, looming over the landscape like sentinels guarding something precious. The excavation began in earnest, but no one could have imagined what they were about to uncover. The first few days were slow. Basil and his small team of laborers worked carefully, mindful not to damage anything. They had no idea what lay beneath, whether it would be an empty mound or something extraordinary. At first, the dig revealed little more than small fragments of iron and decayed wood, signs that the mound had been disturbed before. Yet Basil remained optimistic. He knew that patience was key. As the team continued to remove layers of earth, something remarkable began to take shape, the outline of a ship. Brown could hardly believe his eyes. The sandy soil had preserved an impression of a ship, large enough to befit royalty. The wood had long since decayed, leaving only a ghostly imprint, but the form of the ship was unmistakable. It stretched nearly 90 feet long, a size that suggested this was no ordinary burial. This was something far grander. Word of the discovery spread quickly. Edith Pretty herself came to the site daily, watching with excitement as the ancient vessel emerged from the soil. She had hoped for something significant, but the magnitude of what was being uncovered exceeded her wildest dreams. The ship's structure, though fragile and partially destroyed by time, was evidence of a culture that had mastery over the sea. But it wasn't just the size of the ship that astonished the team. As they dug deeper, they realized that the vessel had been used as a burial ship, likely for someone of great importance. The thought lingered. Could this be the resting place of a long-forgotten king? Excitement turned to trepidation as the team carefully uncovered more of the ship. The scale of the task ahead became clearer. This was not a simple dig. It was a mission to recover a piece of history so old that its very existence had been forgotten. Every move had to be precise, every piece of earth removed with care. Basil Brown knew the significance of what they had found, but he also understood the risks. An excavation of this scale had never been attempted before in England, at least not with such a delicate site. The ship was a marvel, but it was fragile. Any mistake could destroy what little remained. As more of the ship was revealed, it became clear that this was not an isolated find. The ship was part of a much larger burial complex, perhaps one used by an elite group of people warriors, leaders, and rulers. The ship had been placed in the earth with great care, loaded with treasures meant to accompany its occupant into the afterlife. By the end of the summer, the excavation had gained attention beyond Suffolk. Archaeologists from across Britain began to take notice. The press, too, caught wind of the discovery. Headlines soon spoke of Britain's greatest find, and speculation ran wild about the identity of the person buried within the ship. Some believed it could be a legendary king or warrior, a figure whose story had been lost to time. Despite the growing attention, Edith Pretty remained modest about her role in the discovery. She had simply acted on a hunch, following her curiosity. But as the ship continued to reveal its secrets, it became clear that her decision to explore the mounds was one that would reshape the understanding of England's ancient history. The discovery of the ship set the stage for a much larger adventure, one that would continue to unfold in the months and years to come. For now, though, the ship lay beneath the soil, waiting for its full story to be told. As the sun rose over the fields of Suffolk in the summer of 1939, a small team of workers arrived at Suttonhoo, eager to continue their excavation of what was shaping up to be one of the most remarkable finds in British history. Basil Brown, the archaeologist leading the dig, had uncovered the outline of an ancient ship. But what lay beneath was still a mystery. The real work was only just beginning. The excavation site, now buzzing with activity, was far from a glamorous operation. With no heavy machinery and only simple tools like shovels, trowels, and brushes, the work was slow, meticulous, and physically demanding. Each layer of soil had to be removed carefully to avoid disturbing any fragile artifacts that might lie beneath the surface. Time was not on their side, as the threat of war loomed over Europe, adding urgency to their efforts. A small team of workers, mostly local laborers, had little formal training in archaeology, but they followed his instructions diligently. He had a deep respect for the past, and he knew that any mistake, no matter how small, could erase vital clues to understanding the burial. The ship they had uncovered was not made of iron or stone. It had once been a grand wooden vessel. Over the centuries, the wood had decayed, leaving only the impression of the ship in the soil. This meant that the entire outline of the ship was incredibly delicate, requiring precision to uncover it without causing damage. As they dug deeper, the true size of the ship became more apparent. Nearly 90 feet long, it was the kind of ship that could only have belonged to someone of great importance. It wasn't just its size that amazed the team. It was the craftsmanship. The lines of the ship's hull were graceful, curving elegantly through the earth, a testament to the shipbuilders who had constructed it more than 1,000 years earlier. Brown's excitement grew as the excavation progressed, but so did his sense of responsibility. The discovery of the ship was already monumental, but he knew there had to be more. Anglo-Saxon burial customs suggested that whoever was buried here had been laid to rest with treasures fit for a king. The ship, it seemed, was just the beginning. As the days passed, the team began to uncover a wealth of small finds, pieces of iron, fragments of pottery, and even a few rusted nails that hinted at the ship's construction. These items were important, but they were not the treasures the team had hoped to find. Still, Basil remained patient. He knew that the most valuable artifacts were likely still hidden deeper within the burial chamber, and he was determined to reach them. The dig became more challenging as they approached the center of the ship, where the burial chamber was believed to be. The earth here was heavier, and the signs of earlier disturbances, likely grave robbers from centuries past, became more evident. Some parts of the ship had been damaged, either by the passage of time or by human hands, but there were still large sections of the vessel that remained untouched. One day, as the team carefully removed soil from the center of the ship, they uncovered something extraordinary, a large wooden structure that had once formed the burial chamber. Though the wood itself had long since decayed, the impression it left behind was unmistakable. The chamber was large enough to hold not only a body, but also the treasures that would have accompanied it. Basil Brown was struck by the enormity of what they had found. This wasn't just a ship burial, it was a royal tomb. The chamber was situated in the very heart of the ship, a place of honor reserved for someone of the highest status. Though the chamber had been damaged over the centuries, there were still signs that it had once held magnificent items. The team worked slowly, methodically, removing the earth surrounding the chamber. As they did, they began to find objects that hinted at the grandeur of the burial. The first signs were small metal fragments, delicate pieces of jewelry, and the remnants of finely crafted items that had once adorned the body. These objects, though decayed, were exquisite in their design, suggesting that the person buried here had been incredibly wealthy, perhaps even a king. But the true treasures of the burial had not yet been uncovered. Brown knew that the most significant finds were still hidden beneath layers of soil. The team worked tirelessly, day after day, uncovering more and more of the burial chamber. The anticipation was palpable. Every piece of earth they removed brought them closer to the moment of revelation. As the excavation continued, word of the discovery spread even further. Archaeologists from across the country began to take notice, and some even traveled to Sutton Hoo to witness the dig for themselves. It was becoming clear that this was no ordinary excavation. What they had uncovered was one of the greatest archaeological finds in British history, and it was only a matter of time before the world would know the full extent of the discovery. Despite the growing attention, Basil Brown remained focused on the task at hand. The pressure was immense, but he knew that they were on the verge of something incredible. The burial chamber was nearly fully exposed, and soon they would uncover the treasures that had been hidden for centuries. As the final layers of earth were removed from the chamber, the team began to realize just how grand the burial truly was. They found evidence of finely wrought metalwork, including gold and silver items that had once adorned the person buried within. Though many of the treasures had been damaged or lost to time, what remained was enough to suggest that this was the burial of someone truly significant. The discovery of the burial chamber was a turning point in the excavation. What had begun as a simple curiosity had become a full-scale archaeological dig, one that would change the understanding of early medieval England. For Basil Brown and his team, the discovery of the ship and the chamber was just the beginning of a much larger story, one that would unfold in the months and years to come. The discovery of the burial chamber at Sutton Hoo marked a turning point in the excavation. The ship had been a stunning find, but the treasures hidden within the chamber were what truly revealed the significance of this ancient burial. As Basil Brown and his team carefully removed the last layers of soil, they began to uncover a collection of artifacts that hinted at the immense wealth and status of the person entombed within. The burial chamber, located at the heart of the ship, had likely once contained a wooden coffin, though all traces of the wood had long since decayed. What remained, however, was a dazzling array of items that had been placed alongside the body items that spoke of a life of power, influence, and high social standing. This was no ordinary grave. This was the final resting place of someone of immense importance, perhaps even a king. One of the first objects to emerge from the soil was a magnificent helmet. Though damaged by time and the elements, it was clear that this was no simple piece of armor. The helmet was adorned with intricate designs, including representations of fierce animals and warriors, all crafted in exquisite detail. It had once been worn by a figure of great significance, someone who likely commanded both respect and fear. The helmet, with its mask-like faceplate and iron cheek pieces, gave the impression of a powerful warrior king. Its craftsmanship suggested that the person buried here had connections to distant lands, perhaps Scandinavia, where similar helmets had been found. As the team continued to excavate, they uncovered more treasures. A finely wrought sword was found next, its hilt inlaid with gold and garnets. The sword was a symbol of power, not just a weapon, but a representation of the authority of the one who had wielded it. Alongside the sword were other items associated with warfare, including a large shield and a collection of spears. These were the tools of a leader, someone who had commanded armies and fought in battles. The items painted a picture of a man who had been both a ruler and a warrior, a figure whose life had been shaped by conflict and conquest. Yet the burial chamber also contained objects of great beauty, items that suggested the person buried here had enjoyed a life of luxury and refinement. Gold buckles, intricately crafted jewelry, and a collection of silverware were found, each piece more ornate than the last. Some of the items had been imported from far-off lands, including silver bowls and spoons from the Byzantine Empire, evidence of trade and cultural connections that spanned continents. These items showed that the person buried here had lived in a time when England was not an isolated island, but part of a wider world, a world connected by trade routes and diplomacy. Perhaps the most striking find was a large, elaborately decorated belt buckle made of solid gold. Weighing over a pound, the buckle was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, featuring interwoven patterns that symbolized strength and unity. Its size and weight suggested that it had been worn by someone of great stature, both physically and socially. The buckle, along with the other treasures, spoke of immense wealth, the kind of wealth that only the most powerful in society could accumulate. As the team cataloged the items found in the burial chamber, it became increasingly clear that this was not just a burial, it was a statement. The person buried here had wanted to be remembered, to leave a lasting legacy. The ship, the treasures, and the sheer scale of the burial all suggested that this had been a leader of extraordinary influence, someone who had shaped the course of history in their time. But who was this person? That question lingered over the excavation like a shadow. No body had been found in the burial chamber. Centuries of decay had left little more than traces of organic matter where the body once lay. Still, archaeologists were able to piece together clues from the artifacts and the burial itself. The size of the ship and the opulence of the treasures suggested that this was the grave of an Anglo-Saxon king, perhaps even Redwald, the ruler of East Anglia in the early 7th century. Redwald was a powerful figure in Anglo-Saxon England. According to historical records, he had been a strong leader who wielded significant influence over other kings in the region. He had converted to Christianity, but also maintained traditional pagan beliefs, a fact reflected in the mix of Christian and pagan symbols found in the burial chamber. If this was indeed the grave of Redwald, it would confirm his status as one of the most important figures of the Anglo-Saxon period. The burial also revealed much about the society in which this leader had lived. The treasures found in the chamber were not just symbols of personal wealth. They were representations of the interconnectedness of early medieval Europe. The silver from Byzantium, the garnets from India, and the craftsmanship influenced by Scandinavian designs all pointed to a world in which goods, ideas, and cultures flowed across borders. But while the items found in the burial chamber were awe-inspiring, they also raised questions. What had caused this king to be buried in such a grand manner? Had his death been the result of natural causes, or had he fallen in battle? Had this burial been a display of his people's devotion, or was it meant to send a message to those who came after him? The ship, laden with treasures, seemed to speak of a desire to carry these symbols of power into the afterlife, a belief that even in death, this leader would continue to hold sway over the world. As the excavation came to an end, the team knew they had uncovered something truly extraordinary. The burial chamber at Suttonhoo had revealed treasures that had been hidden for more than 1,000 years. Treasures that told the story of a long-forgotten king and the world in which he had lived. For Basil Brown and his team, it was the culmination of months of hard work and dedication. But for the wider world, it was just the beginning of a new understanding of England's past. The treasures of Suttonhoo would soon be displayed in museums, where people from all over the world could come and marvel at the craftsmanship and beauty of these ancient artifacts. Yet, even as they were cleaned and preserved, they would remain tied to the mystery of the person who had been buried in that ship, a figure whose identity might never be known for certain, but whose legacy would live on through the objects he left behind. The burial chamber had been unearthed, but its secrets would continue to captivate the imaginations of historians, archaeologists, and the public for generations to come. The excavation at Sutton Hoo had revealed extraordinary treasures, but it was the discovery's ripple effect that truly began to reshape the understanding of England's ancient past. As word of the find spread across Britain, the magnitude of what had been uncovered became clear, not just to archaeologists, but to the general public, scholars, and even political figures. The Sutton Hoo ship burial was quickly recognized as one of the most important archaeological finds in British history, a window into a time that had long been shrouded in mystery. In the summer of 1939, just as the treasures from Sutton Hoo were being carefully excavated, the world was on the brink of conflict. The tensions leading to the outbreak of World War II were mounting, and in many ways, the discovery at Sutton Hoo served as a reminder of Britain's deep history and resilience. As the nation prepared for the uncertainties of war, the treasures from this ancient burial offered a sense of pride and continuity, connecting modern Britons to their Anglo-Saxon ancestors. For Edith Pretty, the landowner whose curiosity had sparked the excavation, the discovery had an emotional impact. She had long suspected that the mounds on her estate hid something special, but even she couldn't have imagined the grandeur of what lay beneath. Edith, a reserved and thoughtful woman, had always been interested in history and archaeology, but the scale of the find at Sutton Hoo exceeded her wildest expectations. She visited the excavation site daily, quietly observing as Basil Brown and his team painstakingly unearthed each artifact. Though Edith had initiated the dig, she remained humble about her role, insisting that the discovery belonged to history. In the months following the excavation, Edith made a decision that would forever cement her place in the story of Sutton Hoo. Rather than keeping the treasures for herself or selling them, she donated the entire collection to the British Museum. It was an act of generosity that reflected her deep sense of responsibility to history and her desire for the treasures to be studied and preserved for future generations. The decision ensured that the artifacts would be accessible to the public and to scholars, who would spend decades analyzing the find and its implications. The British Museum, which had long been a repository for the world's greatest cultural artifacts, was quick to recognize the importance of the Sutton Hoo treasures. The items, including the famous helmet, the gold belt buckle, and the intricately crafted jewelry, were displayed prominently, attracting visitors from across the country and beyond. People flocked to see the artifacts, eager to catch a glimpse of the ancient past and to learn more about the mysterious figure who had been buried in such splendor. The public reaction to the Sutton Hoo discovery was overwhelming. Newspapers ran headlines about the buried treasure and the king in the ship, fueling speculation about the identity of the person entombed in the ship burial. Theories abounded, with some suggesting that the ship had belonged to a legendary warrior, while others believed it was the resting place of a great king. The fascination with the find extended beyond the borders of Britain, with international scholars and archaeologists expressing interest in studying the artifacts and the burial site. But while the treasures themselves were stunning, it was the broader implications of the discovery that truly excited the academic community. Before Sutton Hoo, the early medieval period in England, often referred to as the Dark Ages, was seen as a time of cultural stagnation, a period following the fall of the Roman Empire, when much of Europe was thought to have fallen into disarray. The Sutton Hoo find challenged this view, offering evidence of a sophisticated and cosmopolitan society that had existed in England in the 6th and 7th centuries. The discovery of objects from distant lands, including silverware from Byzantium and garnets from as far away as India, demonstrated that the Anglo-Saxon elite were part of a vast network of trade and cultural exchange. These connections extended across Europe and beyond, suggesting that early medieval England was far more interconnected with the wider world than previously thought. The items found in the burial chamber revealed a society that valued craftsmanship, artistry, and wealth, a far cry from the image of a dark and isolated age. For historians and archaeologists, the Sutton Hoo ship burial opened up new lines of inquiry. Who was the person buried in the ship, and what did his burial tell us about the society he lived in? The consensus began to form around the idea that the burial belonged to Redwold, the King of East Anglia, a powerful figure who had been instrumental in the politics of early medieval England. While no definitive proof existed to confirm Redwold's identity as the person buried in the ship, the evidence, both historical and archaeological, pointed strongly in that direction. As the academic community delved deeper into the meaning of the Sutton Hoo treasures, the site itself became a point of national pride. The discovery was seen as a testament to Britain's deep and rich history, a reminder that the country's roots extended far back into the early medieval period. This sense of pride was particularly potent in the context of the looming war. As Britain prepared for the possibility of conflict, the Sutton Hoo find served as a symbol of resilience and continuity, a reminder that the nation had weathered countless challenges throughout its long history. However, the outbreak of World War II in September 1939 brought new challenges to the preservation of the Sutton Hoo treasures. The artifacts, now housed in the British Museum, were packed away and moved to secure storage to protect them from potential bombing raids. It would be several years before they could be displayed again, but even in storage, the significance of the find continued to grow. In the years following the war, the treasures of Sutton Hoo were once again placed on display, drawing renewed interest from scholars and the public alike. The site itself became a place of pilgrimage for those interested in England's early medieval past. Archaeological work at Sutton Hoo continued, with new discoveries shedding further light on the burial and the culture that had created it. As time passed, the Sutton Hoo ship burial became more than just an archaeological discovery. It became a symbol of Britain's cultural heritage. The treasures found in the burial chamber were celebrated not just for their beauty, but for what they represented, a connection to the distant past, to a time when kings ruled the land and the seas, and when the Anglo-Saxon people laid the foundations for the England that would emerge in the centuries to come. The impact of Sutton Hoo extended beyond the academic world. It influenced popular culture, inspiring books, films, and even artwork. The treasures, with their intricate designs and mysterious origins, captured the imagination of people around the world. The Sutton Hoo helmet, in particular, became an iconic symbol of Anglo-Saxon England, its distinctive design appearing in countless representations of early medieval warriors. But more than anything, Sutton Hoo stood as a testament to the power of curiosity and perseverance. What had begun as a simple desire to explore a set of burial mounds on a quiet Suffolk estate had led to one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history. The impact of that discovery would be felt for generations, reminding the world of the enduring legacy of the Anglo-Saxon people and the mysteries that still lay buried beneath the earth. The Sutton Hoo discovery forever altered the understanding of early medieval England. Long after the final artifact had been unearthed and the excavation had concluded, the mysteries of the ship burial continued to captivate historians, archaeologists, and the general public. The artifacts, now safely housed in the British Museum, were more than just relics. They were keys to unlocking a forgotten past, one that had been shrouded in mystery for centuries. As scholars continued to study the treasures, new insights into the life and times of the Anglo-Saxons emerged. The burial itself became a symbol of the sophisticated society that had existed in England during the early 7th century, a society far more complex and interconnected than previously believed. Sutton Hoo had given the world a glimpse into the life of a ruler who had commanded immense respect and wielded significant power, whether it was Redwold, as many believed, or another figure of equal prominence. Despite all that had been uncovered, questions still lingered. Chief among them was the identity of the person buried in the ship. While the evidence pointed strongly to Redwold, the lack of definitive proof left room for debate. Some scholars suggested alternative possibilities, including other kings or powerful nobles from the East Anglian kingdom. The absence of human remains, likely lost to the ravages of time and the acidic soil, meant that the mystery of the burial's occupant might never be fully resolved. Even without a clear identity, the significance of the burial was undeniable. The ship, the treasures, and the careful arrangement of the grave goods all pointed to someone of immense importance. This was a person whose life had been marked by power, prestige, and wealth, someone who had commanded loyalty and respect from those around them. The grandeur of the burial reflected the importance placed on status and honor in Anglo-Saxon society, where kings and nobles were celebrated both in life and in death. The mystery extended beyond the identity of the buried figure. The purpose of the ship burial itself raised questions. Why had such an elaborate ceremony been conducted, and what did it symbolize? Ship burials were rare in England, and the practice was more commonly associated with Scandinavian cultures. Some historians believe that the Sutton Hoo burial was a reflection of the complex cultural influences at play in early medieval England. The Anglo-Saxons, who had come to Britain as invaders, had absorbed elements of both Roman and Scandinavian traditions, creating a unique blend of customs and beliefs. The ship burial, with its mixture of Christian and pagan symbols, suggested that the person buried at Sutton Hoo had navigated a world in which old and new beliefs coexisted. Redwold, if he was indeed the person buried there, had been known for his dual faith embracing Christianity while still honoring traditional pagan practices. The burial reflected this tension, with the treasures revealing a world in which religious beliefs were evolving, but not yet settled. The items found in the burial chamber also offered clues about the broader world in which this person had lived. The silverware from Byzantium, the garnets from India, and the craftsmanship influenced by Scandinavian and Frankish designs all pointed to a world connected by trade and diplomacy. The Sutton Hoo burial was not just a testament to one person's power. It was a reflection of a global network of exchange, where goods and ideas flowed across borders. As the years passed, Sutton Hoo became a touchstone for those studying the early medieval period. Archaeologists continued to explore the site, conducting further excavations and uncovering additional evidence of the Anglo-Saxon people who had once inhabited the area. While no discoveries rivaled the grandeur of the original ship burial, each new find added to the growing picture of life in East Anglia during the early 7th century. The site itself was transformed into a place of historical importance. Sutton Hoo, once a quiet estate with little public attention, became a destination for visitors from around the world. People came to walk among the burial mounds, to imagine the grand ship that had once rested beneath the earth, and to learn about the Anglo-Saxon kings who had shaped England's early history. The National Trust, which took over the management of the site, worked to preserve the landscape and educate the public about the significance of the discovery. The Sutton Hoo ship burial also left a lasting mark on popular culture. The story of the excavation and the treasures it uncovered inspired books, documentaries, and films, all seeking to capture the drama and mystery of the find. The iconic image of the Sutton Hoo helmet, with its menacing faceplate and intricate designs, became a symbol of Anglo-Saxon England, appearing in countless depictions of early medieval warriors. The discovery continued to spark the imaginations of writers, artists, and filmmakers who were drawn to the idea of a long-lost king buried with his treasures, waiting to be rediscovered. Yet for all the attention Sutton Hoo received, the site remained, at its core, a place of deep historical and emotional significance. The ship burial was a reminder of the fragility of history, of how easily the past can be forgotten, buried beneath layers of earth, and how it can be uncovered only through persistence and curiosity. Basil Brown, The self-taught archaeologist who had first unearthed the ship had never imagined the scope of what he would find. His dedication and careful work had revealed a treasure trove of history that might otherwise have remained hidden. In the decades following the excavation, Brown's role in the discovery was finally recognized. Though initially overshadowed by professional archaeologists who had later joined the dig, Brown's contributions were celebrated as those of a skilled and dedicated archaeologist. His careful methods and deep respect for the site had ensured that the treasures of Sutton Hoo were preserved for future generations. Today, he is remembered as the man who brought one of England's greatest archaeological discoveries to light. As the 21st century began, Sutton Hoo continued to capture the public's imagination. New technologies allowed archaeologists to explore the site in ways that had once been impossible, using ground-penetrating radar and other tools to search for hidden features beneath the earth. These advancements, while yielding fascinating insights, also underscored how much of the past still lay waiting to be discovered. The ship burial at Sutton Hoo was just one chapter in a much larger story, one that archaeologists and historians were still piecing together. For all the answers Sutton Hoo had provided, the site remained a place of wonder and speculation. Who had been buried there, and what had their life been like? What had driven their people to create such a magnificent burial? And what did it say about their beliefs, their values, and their place in the world? These questions, and many others, would likely remain unanswered, but that was part of the magic of Sutton Hoo. It was a place where history and mystery intertwined, where the past reached out to the present in ways both profound and elusive. The ship and its treasures had been buried for more than 1,000 years, hidden from the world, waiting for the right moment to be found. And now, as the story of Sutton Hoo continued to unfold, it was clear that the discovery had not only changed the way people understood the past, it had become part of the fabric of Britain's national identity, a reminder of the deep roots that connected the present to the distant, mysterious past. The year was 1974. And the Smurl family was eager to begin a new chapter in their lives. Jack and Janet Smurl, along with their young daughters, Dawn and Heather, were moving into a quiet neighborhood in West Pittston, Pennsylvania. They were an ordinary family, working class, looking forward to creating a peaceful life together. Their new home, a duplex, was modest but felt like a fresh start. It was the kind of house where Jack could imagine their kids growing up, safe and sound. Little did they know that it would become the setting for a nightmare that would challenge their understanding of reality. The move itself had gone smoothly enough. Jack had just received a promotion at work, and while the extra responsibilities weighed on him, it also meant more financial security for his growing family. Janet, ever the optimist, had already begun mentally decorating their new home. She saw potential in every corner, every wall, every floorboard. Despite its age and the need for some repairs, she felt hopeful. After all, it was a house they could truly make their own. But from the very beginning, the house felt different. At first, it was nothing overtly alarming, just an uneasy feeling that neither Jack nor Janet could quite shake. The air inside the house always seemed cooler than it should have been, especially in the upstairs rooms. There was a certain heaviness in some areas, like the air was denser, harder to breathe. Janet would sometimes feel as though she was being watched, but when she turned around, there was no one there. Then came the sounds. It started with light scratching noises in the walls. Jack, a practical man, assumed it was mice and set about putting down traps, but nothing ever turned up. The scratching persisted. At night, the family would hear soft whispers, faint but unnerving. Sometimes the voices seemed to come from the attic, but when Jack went to check, he found nothing but old insulation and dust. There were no drafts, no wind that could be causing the sounds, and yet the whispers continued. At this point, The family tried to rationalize what was happening. The house was old, so it made sense that there would be creaks and groans. They were still settling in after all. Janet, ever the voice of reason, would reassure herself and the girls that the house was just getting used to them. But deep down, a seed of unease had already been planted. Weeks passed, and the odd occurrences began to escalate. Janet was in the kitchen one afternoon, preparing lunch, when she noticed a dark stain forming on the ceiling above. Her heart sank. Plumbing issues were the last thing they needed. But when Jack came to inspect it, he found that the pipes were fine. The stain, which looked like a deep red blotch, couldn't be explained. Even more disturbingly, it seemed to vanish later that evening, as though it had never been there at all. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, a light bulb exploded in the living room. Glass showered the floor, and the family jumped back in shock. Jack cursed under his breath, muttering something about faulty wiring, but when he replaced the bulb, everything seemed normal again. The next day, though, another bulb blew out in the hallway. This time, Janet noticed that the air had grown cold moments before the explosion, sending a chill down her spine. As the incidents piled up, it became increasingly difficult to dismiss them as mere coincidences. Jack, ever the rational thinker, tried to maintain control of the situation. He busied himself with work, throwing himself into his job to avoid acknowledging the strangeness at home. Janet, on the other hand, began to feel the strain more acutely. She spent more time in the house than anyone else, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to press down on her more and more each day. One particularly unsettling night, as Janet lay in bed beside a sleeping Jack, she heard footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, like someone pacing outside their bedroom door. Thinking it was one of the girls, she got up to check. But when she opened the door, the hallway was empty. Her daughters were fast asleep in their rooms, and yet the sound of footsteps continued, echoing faintly as though coming from just out of reach. Fear gripped Janet, but she refused to let it consume her. She told herself it was her imagination, maybe just the house settling. But deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. She could feel it in her bones. The house wasn't just old. It was something else entirely. And whatever was there, it wasn't friendly. The children, too, began to notice strange things. Dawn, the eldest, mentioned seeing shadows moving in her room at night, though there were no trees or passing cars that could account for them. Heather, still too young to fully understand, complained of bad dreams. She would often wake up crying, saying there was someone in her room watching her. Janet did her best to comfort her daughters, but inside, her anxiety was growing. Jack, still unwilling to fully accept what was happening, brushed off their concerns. He chalked it up to stress from the move, but as the days turned into weeks, even he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. He would come home from work and find the lights flickering, or a door that had been firmly shut would now be wide open. Still, he insisted that they could handle it, that it was all in their heads. But one night, something happened that shattered Jack's skepticism. As he and Janet were watching television in the living room, a foul, rotten stench filled the air. It was so overpowering that it made them gag. Jack leaped up, convinced there was a dead animal trapped somewhere in the house. But after searching every inch of the room, he found nothing. The smell lingered for hours, then disappeared just as suddenly as it had arrived. From that moment on, Jack could no longer deny that something was terribly, horribly wrong with their new home. The once warm promise of a fresh start had been overshadowed by a creeping darkness, something neither of them could explain but both could feel. The house, which had once represented hope and security, was now a source of fear and uncertainty. And as the days passed, the Smurls began to realize that whatever was happening wasn't going to stop. It was only just beginning. As the chapter closes, the family's unease is palpable. They are trapped between denial and dread, unwilling to admit what they all now suspect. They were not alone in that house. Something unseen and malevolent had taken root, and it was growing stronger with each passing day. This would be the beginning of their long, harrowing battle against an evil they could neither see nor understand. As the weeks turned into months, the small family's sense of unease morphed into outright fear. What had begun as strange sounds and fleeting shadows became impossible to ignore. The malevolent presence in their home was growing stronger, and with it, the intensity of the disturbances. The first sign that things had taken a darker turn came one afternoon when Janet was alone in the house. She had just put Heather down for a nap and was folding laundry in the bedroom when the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Her heart quickened. Jack wasn't due home from work for hours, and the children were asleep. She tried to stay calm, convincing herself that it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But the sound persisted, growing louder and more deliberate, as though someone or something was pacing just outside her door. With shaky hands, Janet crept to the hallway, half expecting to see one of the girls out of bed. But the hallway was empty, and the air was thick with that now familiar chill. She stood there, frozen, as the footsteps seemed to move through the house. They thudded across the ceiling, down the stairs, and into the kitchen. Janet's breath caught in her throat. There was no explanation for it. It felt as though an invisible intruder was making its way through their home, indifferent to her presence, but undeniably there. When Jack came home later that evening, Janet recounted the events, her voice trembling with fear. But Jack, still clinging to the hope that all of this had a rational explanation, downplayed her concerns. "Old houses make noise," he said, though he knew in his heart that this was no ordinary creak or groan of aging wood. That night, the family was jolted awake by a series of violent bangs. It sounded like someone was slamming doors all throughout the house. Jack leaped out of bed, rushing down the hallway to check on the girls. They were huddled together in Dawn's room, their eyes wide with terror. Dawn insisted that she had seen a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed just moments before the noises began. This time, Jack didn't have an answer. He checked the windows and doors, ensuring they were all locked, but nothing was out of place. The banging had stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Janet stood in the hallway, clutching her robe tightly around her, feeling utterly helpless. Whatever was in their home was no longer content with being subtle. It was making its presence known. As the days passed, the activity in the house grew more physical. Objects began to move on their own. It started small. Janet would find the kitchen chairs out of place or the TV remote on the opposite side of the room. But soon, larger items were being tossed around as though by an invisible force. One afternoon, as Janet was preparing dinner, a heavy cabinet door swung open and slammed shut with such force that it cracked the wood. The noise startled her so badly that she dropped the knife she was holding, cutting her hand in the process. Blood dripped onto the countertop as she stood there, frozen in shock. The children, too, were affected. Dawn and Heather would often wake up in the middle of the night, screaming, insisting they had seen people in their rooms. Dawn spoke of a shadowy figure that seemed to follow her around the house, always just out of sight, but unmistakably there. Heather, barely old enough to understand, became withdrawn, refusing to sleep in her room unless someone was with her. Even during the day, the girls were on edge, jumping at the slightest sound or movement. Jack tried to maintain a sense of control, but the strain was beginning to show. He started staying at work later, desperate to avoid the suffocating atmosphere of their home. But even at the office, he couldn't escape the feeling that something dark had latched onto his family. His co-workers noticed the change in him. His once easygoing demeanor had been replaced by exhaustion and irritability. It wasn't just the physical disturbances that weighed on them. The emotional toll of living in constant fear was taking its toll. Jack and Janet, who had once been a loving and supportive couple, now found themselves snapping at each other over the smallest things. Tension hung thick in the air, not just from the entity that haunted them, but from the cracks it was creating in their marriage. One night, as Jack sat in the living room trying to distract himself with the evening news, the smell returned, the same foul, rotting stench that had overwhelmed them before. It seeped into the room so suddenly and so intensely that he gagged. He rushed to open a window, but the smell clung to him, making the room feel even more suffocating. Janet, who had been upstairs putting the girls to bed, came downstairs with a look of horror on her face. "It's in their room, Jack," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I can feel it. It's watching them." Jack didn't want to believe it, but the fear in her eyes was undeniable. In the days that followed, things only got worse. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, a deep growling sound filled the air, seeming to come from the walls themselves. Jack and Janet froze, the girls crying in terror as the sound grew louder, more menacing. It felt as though the house itself was alive, a malevolent force surrounding them, closing in. For the first time, Jack found himself admitting the unthinkable. There was something in their house, something beyond their understanding. The fear that had been gnawing at him for months was now fully realized. They were not imagining things, and this wasn't some harmless poltergeist. This was something darker, more dangerous. Despite his reluctance, Jack agreed to seek outside help. The tension in their home had become unbearable, and the safety of their children was now at stake. Janet had been begging him for weeks to call anyone who could help. She had heard of people who specialized in these kinds of situations, people who had experience dealing with the supernatural. Though Jack still felt a flicker of doubt, he knew they could no longer handle this alone. The day after the growling incident, Jack reached out to a local priest. He was skeptical at first, but willing to listen to their story. The priest agreed to visit their home, offering to perform a blessing in the hopes of dispelling whatever evil was lurking there. But when he arrived, the house seemed to fight back. The air grew thick and heavy, and the temperature dropped noticeably. The priest, visibly shaken, said prayers and sprinkled holy water throughout the rooms, but it did little to calm the atmosphere. That night, the disturbances grew even worse. As the family huddled together in the living room, the lights flickered wildly, plunging them into darkness. A loud crash came from the kitchen, as though all the dishes had been hurled to the floor. Jack ran to investigate, but found nothing out of place. The house was playing with them, tormenting them in ways that defied logic and reason. Janet could no longer hide the deep sense of dread she felt every waking moment. She had always believed in the goodness of the world, but now, faced with the unrelenting terror in their own home, she was starting to lose hope. The entity seemed to feed on their fear, growing stronger with every passing day. It wasn't just a haunting. It was a slow, deliberate attack on their sanity, their faith, and their family. By the end of the chapter, the Smurls are on the verge of breaking. Jack's skepticism has been shattered, and Janet's resolve is weakening. The paranormal disturbances are no longer random. They are targeted, deliberate, and malicious. The family is trapped in a nightmare they can't escape, and as they stand on the precipice of despair, they know one thing for certain. Whatever is in their house has no intention of leaving. By now, the Smurl family had reached a breaking point. The eerie occurrences that once felt like unsettling background noise to their lives had transformed into a full-fledged assault on their sanity and safety. They could no longer deny what was happening inside their home. Something dark, malicious, and far beyond their control had taken root. With no other options left, Jack and Janet made the difficult decision to seek outside help. They needed answers, and more importantly, they needed a way to reclaim their lives. Janet had heard whispers about a couple who specialized in cases like theirs Ed and Lorraine Warren, well-known paranormal investigators with years of experience. The Warrens had built their reputation by helping families who were dealing with the unexplainable. They weren't just ghost hunters. They were demonologists who had encountered entities far worse than a typical haunting. It was a last-ditch effort, but the Smurls were desperate. They hoped that the Warrens could offer some sort of explanation, or better yet, a solution. The first meeting with Ed and Lorraine Warren was one of cautious hope. The couple arrived at the small residence in the late afternoon, their faces solemn yet kind. They had seen this kind of fear before, the kind that eats away at people's peace of mind, leaving them fragile and unsure. Lorraine, a clairvoyant, could feel the heaviness in the air before she even stepped through the door. She looked at Janet with a mixture of sympathy and concern, knowing full well what might lie ahead. Inside, the house was as cold and unwelcoming as ever. Ed wasted no time in setting up his equipment, audio recorders, infrared cameras, and temperature gauges. He wanted to document every possible sign of the paranormal. Lorraine, on the other hand, walked slowly through the rooms, her eyes half closed as she reached out with her mind, trying to connect with whatever presence lingered there. Her expression darkened as she moved from room to room. "There's something here," Lorraine whispered to Janet as they stood in the hallway, her voice barely audible. "It's not just one spirit. I can feel multiple presences, angry, confused, and something much darker. Much worse." Janet's stomach twisted in knots. She had known, deep down, that it wasn't just her imagination. But hearing it confirmed by someone like Lorraine Warren made it all the more terrifying. Ed approached, his brow furrowed. "We're dealing with more than just a haunting here," he said. "There's a demonic entity in this house, possibly more than one. It's feeding off the fear, off the tension in the family." The words sent a chill down Janet's spine. Demonic. She had feared as much, but hearing it spoken out loud was like a punch to the gut. Demons weren't just ghosts. They were something far more malevolent, something designed to harm and destroy. The Smurls weren't just dealing with a few bumps in the night. They were facing an active threat, one that had already begun to tear at the fabric of their family. The Warrens explained that such entities often latched onto people, not just places. Demons could be drawn to negativity, emotional pain, conflict, or unresolved trauma. Jack and Janet couldn't help but think back to the struggles they had faced in recent years. Jack's difficult job, Janet's bouts of anxiety, the stress of raising young children. Had the house sensed their vulnerabilities and taken advantage? Ed suggested performing a spiritual cleansing of the home. It wouldn't be easy, he warned, and there was no guarantee that it would work right away. Sometimes, these entities fought back when threatened, lashing out even more violently. But the Smurls were willing to try anything. The first cleansing was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, the Warrens advised the family to stay strong and not to give in to fear. "That's what it wants," Ed explained. "The more you give into it, the more power it gains. Stand together as a family and don't let it divide you." But standing strong was easier said than done. That very night, after the Warrens had left, the activity in the house reached a new level of terror. Jack and Janet were jolted awake in the middle of the night by a loud crash downstairs. It sounded like furniture had been overturned. Jack rushed to investigate, his heart pounding in his chest. The dining room table had been flipped on its side, chairs strewn across the floor. Yet there was no sign of anyone, no intruder, no open windows, nothing that could explain the mess. As Jack stood there in disbelief, a deep guttural growl echoed through the room. It was low and menacing, vibrating through the walls like an animal stalking its prey. Jack felt a surge of panic, his breath catching in his throat. He had never heard anything like it. He backed away, feeling an icy presence behind him, though when he turned, there was nothing there. Upstairs, Janet was trying to comfort the girls, who had been awakened by the noise. Dawn was sobbing, her voice shaking as she told her mother about the dark figure she had seen standing at the foot of her bed again. Heather was too scared to speak, clutching her blanket as though it were her only protection from the malevolent force lurking in the house. The following day, Ed and Lorraine returned to conduct the cleansing. Armed with holy water, crucifixes, and prayers, they walked through the house, blessing each room, calling on the entity to leave. Lorraine led the spiritual rites, her voice steady but tense. Janet and Jack followed closely, praying silently, hoping against hope that this would be enough to rid their home of the evil presence. At first, the house seemed to resist. The air grew cold, and the smell of sulfur filled the air, an unmistakable sign of something unholy. The lights flickered violently, and a mirror in the hallway shattered as if struck by an invisible force. The house groaned, as though it was alive and angry, but Lorraine pressed on, her prayers louder, more forceful. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the house seemed to settle. The oppressive feeling lifted, if only slightly. For the first time in months, Janet felt like she could breathe again. It wasn't over, she knew that much, but the tension that had been suffocating them had eased, if only for the moment. Ed warned the family that they might not be rid of the entity entirely. Sometimes, these things took time. Demonic forces in particular were known for their persistence. They would retreat, only to return stronger if given the chance. Stay vigilant, Ed told them. This could be just the beginning. For a few days, the house was quiet. Jack and Janet allowed themselves to feel a small flicker of hope. Maybe the worst was behind them. Maybe the blessing had worked. But just as they began to relax, the activity returned this time with a vengeance. It started with the shadows. Janet noticed them first dark, shifting forms that moved just out of the corner of her eye. No matter where she was in the house, she felt like something was watching her, lurking just beyond her vision. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, like a distant conversation, but soon they grew louder, more distinct, until they sounded like voices speaking right next to her. But no matter where she looked, there was no one there. The final straw came one night when Jack was lying in bed, trying to sleep. He felt a pressure on his chest, as though something heavy was sitting on top of him, pinning him down. He tried to move, but his body was frozen, paralyzed by an unseen force. A cold, suffocating presence filled the room, and Jack's heart raced as he struggled to breathe. He tried to call out for Janet, but no sound escaped his lips. Suddenly, the pressure lifted, and Jack gasped for air, sitting up in bed. His body trembled, slick with sweat, and the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. Janet had seen enough. Whatever they were facing was beyond anything they could handle on their own. They needed more help, and they needed it fast. The Warrens, though willing to help, knew that they would need to call in reinforcements. This wasn't just a haunting. It was an all-out battle between good and evil, and the Smurls were caught in the crossfire. The question that loomed over them all was simple, yet terrifying. How much more could they endure before the house and whatever was inside it claimed them for good? The Smurl family was trapped in an unrelenting nightmare. The spiritual cleansing performed by Ed and Lorraine Warren had offered only a brief respite. Now, the dark presence in their home was more aggressive than ever. Each night brought new terror, and even the daylight hours offered no true peace. Jack and Janet were no longer just afraid. They were exhausted, physically and emotionally worn down by the relentless assault on their family. As the days passed, they found themselves locked in a fight for their survival, both against the entity and against the growing strain on their own relationship. After Jack's terrifying encounter with the unseen force in their bedroom, the family knew they could no longer remain passive. They couldn't wait and hope that the activity would subside on its own. It was clear that the entity had no intention of leaving them in peace. Jack, who had once been the skeptic, was now the most determined to take action. He could no longer stand to see his wife and children suffer. He was determined to protect them, no matter the cost. The first step was reaching out to the church again. The priest who had blessed the house previously had been reluctant to acknowledge the possibility of something demonic, but after hearing about the escalation of the events, he agreed to return. This time, he brought with him another priest who specialized in exorcisms. The word alone sent a chill through Janet. The idea that their situation had grown dire enough to require such measures was horrifying. The two priests arrived one afternoon, armed with holy water, crucifixes, and Bibles. They walked through the house with solemn expressions, reciting prayers and sprinkling holy water in every room. Jack and Janet followed behind them, clutching their children close. Lorraine Warren had warned them that an exorcism was not a simple fix. It wasn't like in the movies. There were no dramatic confrontations with the demon where everything would be resolved in a single moment. It was a long, grueling process, and sometimes it didn't work the way people hoped. As the priests moved from room to room, the atmosphere in the house seemed to grow heavier. The temperature dropped, and a sense of unease settled over everyone. The entity was not pleased by their efforts. It was resisting. Janet could feel its presence more acutely than ever. It was as though the very walls were watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. In the middle of the blessing, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. Everyone froze. It sounded as though something heavy had fallen, yet there had been no one upstairs. Jack and one of the priests rushed to investigate, only to find that the bedroom mirror had shattered, glass scattered across the floor. The air in the room was thick with the unmistakable stench of sulfur, a sign that the entity was growing more malevolent. Jack felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he stared at the broken glass. It was a reminder that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple haunting. The priests finished the blessing, but their faces betrayed the doubt they felt. The entity had not been driven out, it had only been angered. Janet's hope, which had already been dwindling, now felt crushed beneath the weight of despair. She could see the exhaustion in Jack's eyes. The toll this battle was taking on him. He was doing everything he could to protect their family, but the strain was becoming too much for him to bear. As the days passed, the entity's attacks became more personal. It wasn't just about fear anymore, it was about control. Jack, in particular, seemed to be targeted. He would hear voices whispering in his ear when no one else was around, telling him that he was powerless, that he couldn't protect his family. Objects would move in his presence, as if taunting him, reminding him that he was up against something far beyond his understanding. He began to lose sleep, plagued by nightmares and a constant sense of dread. Janet watched helplessly as the man she loved slowly unraveled under the pressure. The children were not spared either. Dawn, who had always been the most vocal about seeing shadowy figures in her room, now refused to sleep alone. She was terrified that the entity would come for her, and nothing Jack or Janet said could ease her fear. Heather, who had once been a carefree toddler, was now withdrawn, clinging to her mother's side at all times. The once happy family dynamic had been shattered, replaced by a constant undercurrent of tension and anxiety. One evening, as they sat in the living room trying to distract themselves with a movie, the lights suddenly flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and the air grew icy cold. Jack jumped up, grabbing a flashlight, but before he could turn it on, a low growling sound filled the room. It was the same sound they had heard before, deep, guttural, and undeniably evil. Janet's heart raced as she clutched Heather to her chest. She could feel the presence in the room, circling them as if toying with them. The growling grew louder, more menacing, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The lights flickered back on, and the room was silent once more. But the sense of dread remained, hanging over them like a dark cloud. Jack was at his breaking point. He had always been the rational one, the man who could fix things with his hands or his mind. But this was something he couldn't control. It was eating away at him, and he knew that if they didn't find a solution soon, it would destroy them. He had to do something, anything, to regain control of his life and his home. That night, as Jack lay awake in bed, unable to sleep, he made a decision. He would fight back. He wouldn't let this entity take everything from him. He began researching ways to defend against demonic forces, reading everything he could find about spiritual protection, exorcisms, and prayer. He reached out to anyone who might be able to help, from religious figures to paranormal experts. He refused to give up, even as the entity continued to wear him down. One of the experts Jack contacted suggested the entity might be using the negative energy in the house to grow stronger. The family's fear, anger, and despair were fueling it, giving it more power. If they wanted to weaken it, they would need to change their approach. Instead of focusing on the fear, they needed to focus on positivity, on love, faith, and unity. It sounded almost impossible, given the circumstances. But Jack and Janet were willing to try anything. They began to make small changes in their daily lives, trying to reclaim their home in any way they could. They prayed together as a family, ate meals together, and spent time doing activities that brought them joy. It wasn't easy. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corner of their eyes, reminded them of the darkness that still lurked in their home. But they were determined not to let it win. Slowly, the atmosphere in the house began to shift. The oppressive feeling of dread that had hung over them for so long began to lift, if only slightly. The entity was still there, still watching, but its power seemed to be weakening. The growling stopped, the violent outbursts became less frequent, and the shadows that had once plagued Dawn's room seemed to retreat. But the fight wasn't over. Jack and Janet knew that they were still vulnerable, and that the entity could strike again at any moment. They had to stay vigilant, to remain strong in the face of the unknown. Their love for each other, their faith, and their determination to protect their children would be their greatest weapons in the battle ahead. By the end of the chapter, the Smurls had begun to reclaim their lives, but the threat of the entity still loomed large. They had learned that the key to survival wasn't just in fighting the darkness. It was in refusing to let it consume them. The Smurl family's ordeal had stretched far beyond what they could have imagined. What began as strange noises and unsettling encounters had spiraled into a nightmare that dominated every part of their lives. They had survived for months, enduring the torment of the dark entity that inhabited their home. Through the help of experts like Ed and Lorraine Warren, priests, and their own resilience, they had managed to hold on. But they knew that the haunting had not ended. The entity, while seemingly weakened, still lingered in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike again. And it was during one of the darkest nights that the final confrontation unfolded. It had been a few weeks since the last major incident, and the family had started to feel a cautious sense of relief. Jack had continued his efforts to keep the negative energy at bay, focusing on family unity and positive reinforcement. Janet, too, had thrown herself into taking care of the girls, finding comfort in the small moments of normalcy they could still cling to. But the entity had merely been lying in wait, its attacks growing less frequent but more intense. That night, the house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, almost tangible, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Janet was upstairs, tucking the girls into bed, while Jack sat downstairs in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV, but not really watching. He was exhausted, physically and mentally, but his mind refused to shut down. There was always that lingering anxiety, that feeling that something could go wrong at any moment. As Janet kissed Dawn and Heather goodnight, she felt a chill sweep through the room. The temperature dropped suddenly, a familiar coldness that sent a wave of dread through her body. She pulled the blankets tighter around the girls, whispering reassurances that she didn't quite believe herself. She told them to sleep tight, that everything would be okay, even though the pit in her stomach told her otherwise. Downstairs, Jack felt it too. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and the air in the room seemed to thicken. His heart rate quickened as he set the remote down, his eyes scanning the room. He couldn't see anything unusual, but he didn't need to. He knew it was back. Before he could call out to Janet, the lights began to flicker. It started softly at first, a faint buzz as the bulbs dimmed, but within seconds, the flickering became violent, the entire room throbbing in harsh, rapid flashes of light and dark. Jack stood up, his instincts kicking in as he moved toward the stairs to get his family. But as soon as he reached the bottom step, a deafening crash echoed through the house. The sound was so loud it felt like the walls were shaking, and it was followed by a deep, guttural growl, the same growl that had haunted them before. "Janet!" Jack shouted, his voice cracking with fear as he bolted up the stairs 2 at a time. Janet had already heard the crash, and she was racing down the hallway toward him, her face pale. "The girls!" she gasped, but Jack grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the bedroom. They had to get the children and leave the house now. But the entity had other plans. Just as Jack reached for the bedroom door, it slammed shut with a force that knocked him back. He stumbled, pulling Janet with him as they both struggled to regain their footing. The door remained closed, though neither of them had touched it. Behind the door, they could hear Dawn and Heather screaming high-pitched, terrified shrieks that made Janet's blood run cold. "Let us in," Janet cried, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard Jack threw his weight against it, it remained locked, held by some invisible force. Suddenly, the lights in the hallway went out, plunging them into darkness. Only the faint glow of the moon through the window illuminated their surroundings, casting long shadows across the floor. The growling returned, louder this time, and it was followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if something was moving toward them from the other end of the hall. Jack's pulse raced. He had never been so scared in his life, but he knew he couldn't give in to fear. The entity thrived on it. He had to stay calm, for Janet, for the girls. Grabbing her hand, he pulled her close, whispering words of reassurance, even though every fiber of his being screamed to run. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, a deep, raspy voice, one that sounded neither human nor animal, echoed through the hallway. It was speaking in a language Jack didn't understand, guttural and harsh, but the intent was clear. The entity was taunting them, asserting its control over the house, over their lives. But Jack wasn't about to let it win. "Get out of our house!" Jack yelled, his voice hoarse with desperation. He grabbed the crucifix from his pocket, the one he had been carrying ever since the Warrens had warned him to keep it close. Holding it high, he began reciting the Lord's Prayer, his voice shaky but determined. Janet, her heart pounding, joined him. She didn't know if it would work, but it was all they had. Together, they stood side by side, their voices rising above the growling, the footsteps, the oppressive darkness that surrounded them. At first, nothing happened. The entity seemed to grow stronger, the air around them growing thicker, suffocating. But Jack refused to stop. He continued to pray, louder now, as if willing the words to push the darkness back. And then, slowly, the growling began to fade. The footsteps ceased, and the air grew lighter. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on them lifted, if only slightly. The door to the girls' room suddenly flew open, and Jack and Janet rushed inside, finding Dawn and Heather huddled together on the bed, shaking and crying but unharmed. Janet scooped them up, holding them tightly, whispering over and over that everything would be okay, even though she wasn't sure it was. The entity wasn't gone. They could still feel it, lurking in the shadows, watching them. But for the first time in months, it had backed down. They had stood their ground, and it had retreated. For the next few weeks, the house remained quiet. The oppressive atmosphere that had once filled every room was lighter, and the family began to breathe a little easier. But they knew they weren't safe, not completely. The entity was still there, waiting for its chance to strike again. Jack and Janet took the girls to stay with relatives while they continued to work with the Warrens and the church to find a permanent solution. They couldn't live in fear forever, and they couldn't allow the entity to destroy their family. They had survived the worst of it, but the fight wasn't over. It never truly would be. For families like the Smurls, haunted by forces beyond human understanding, the battle between light and dark was a constant one. But they had learned something important. No matter how strong the darkness seemed, as long as they stood together, it could never fully win. In the end, the Small family had endured what many would consider unimaginable. They had faced an evil that most people never encounter, and they had survived. Their story was one of resilience, of love, and of the unbreakable bond that held them together through even the darkest of times. New Orleans, with its vibrant culture and rich history, has long been a city filled with intrigue. The French Quarter, in particular, stands as a testament to centuries of human experience, both glorious and grim. Amidst the colorful streets and lively jazz clubs, there exists a house unlike any other, the infamous Villari Mansion. Its elegant facade hides a story steeped in tragedy, suffering, and a legacy that has haunted the city for nearly 2 centuries. Madame Delphine Lalaurie, born Marie Delphine McCarty in 1787, grew up in a world of privilege. She was part of New Orleans high society, and from an early age, she understood the importance of appearances. Her beauty, charm, and social standing made her one of the most admired women in the city. She was married 3 times, each union increasing her wealth and status. But it was her 3rd marriage, to Dr. Leonard Louis Lalaurie, that would cement her place in the city's dark history. The couple resided at 1140 Royal Street, a grand mansion in the heart of the French Quarter. The house, with its tall windows, iron lace balconies, and stately appearance, was the perfect setting for Delphine's lavish social gatherings. To the outside world, she was the epitome of refinement, hosting elegant parties that attracted the city's elite. Guests marveled at her grace, her wealth, and the beauty of her home. Yet, behind this polished exterior, something far more sinister was happening within the walls of the mansion. From the early days of her residency, rumors swirled about Madame Lalaurie's treatment of those enslaved in her household. While many wealthy families in New Orleans kept enslaved workers, there was something unsettling about the way Delphine interacted with them. Neighbors noticed strange, disturbing incidents, people whispering about how her staff seemed to disappear, never to be seen again. It was said that Madame Lalaurie had an uncharacteristically cold and distant demeanor towards them, a stark contrast to the warmth she showed her high society peers. One story that circulated involved a young girl who had worked in the house. She had been seen brushing Delphine's hair on the balcony one afternoon. Allegedly, the girl made a mistake, tugging too hard at a tangle. Madame Lalaurie, enraged, chased her through the house and onto the rooftop. The young girl, in her fear, leapt to escape Delphine's wrath, falling to her tragic end. It was an incident that should have triggered public outrage, but instead, it was quietly covered up, thanks to Lalaurie's wealth and influence. Over time, other accounts began to emerge. Some spoke of faint cries coming from the mansion late at night, while others claimed they saw strange figures peering from the windows as if pleading for help. Still, Madame Lalaurie's social standing remained intact. Wealth, power, and status allowed her to hide the unspeakable acts that were happening within her home. Dr. Lalaurie, a man of medicine, seemed indifferent to his wife's behavior. Though he was present in the mansion, he often absented himself from the household affairs, spending more time in his practice or indulging in the social privileges of the era. While his presence could have been a moderating influence on his wife, There were rumors that he, too, turned a blind eye to the growing darkness within their home. Madame Lalaurie was careful, ensuring that her public image remained flawless. She continued to host elaborate parties, where the most influential people in New Orleans would gather in her grand ballroom, sipping fine wine, unaware or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge the sinister reality hidden behind the mansion's closed doors. Yet the cracks in this perfect facade were growing harder to ignore. People began whispering more openly about her cruelty. But it wasn't until a tragic event in 1834 that the full extent of the horror within the mansion would be revealed. An accident in the kitchen, a fire that quickly spread, would bring everything to light. As the fire raged through the lower levels of the mansion, passers-by rushed to help. It was during this chaos that the full truth of Delphine Lalaurie's life came to the surface. The firefighters who responded to the blaze discovered something unimaginable, an attic full of unspeakable suffering. This discovery would forever change the legacy of the Lalaurie mansion. Madame Lalaurie, once admired for her beauty and charm, was now reviled. The mansion, which had once been a symbol of wealth and elegance, would forever be stained by the horrors that had occurred within its walls. The building itself seemed to absorb the cruelty, its once pristine appearance now a reminder of the darkness that lingered there. After the fire, the truth spread rapidly through the city. The socialite, once revered, was now despised. Crowds gathered in outrage outside her mansion, demanding justice for the atrocities discovered within. But before they could take any action, Delphine Lalaurie vanished, slipping away into the night, never to face justice for her actions. She fled New Orleans, leaving behind a legacy of cruelty that would forever haunt the city. The Lalaurie mansion, scarred by its history, was left to stand as a reminder of the dark deeds that had taken place within. Over the years, it would be sold and resold, with each new owner finding themselves unable to live comfortably within its walls. The mansion had become something more than just a house. It had become a symbol of the city's most tragic chapter, a place where the echoes of the past continued to linger. The events of April 10, 1834, marked a turning point for the city of New Orleans. A fire broke out in the kitchen of the Grand Lalaurie mansion, sending thick plumes of smoke into the sky. Neighbors rushed to help, fearing for the safety of Madame Delphine Lalaurie and her family. As they approached the house, what began as a simple act of concern quickly spiraled into a moment that would shock the city to its core. The fire, though dangerous, was not the main story. It was what the fire revealed that would leave an indelible scar on the history of New Orleans. As firefighters battled the flames, they discovered a locked room on the top floor, an attic that was previously hidden from view. Desperate cries from inside the house led them to force open the door. What they found would horrify even the most hardened among them. The attic was not merely a storage space, but a chamber of unimaginable suffering. Within its dark and claustrophobic walls, a group of enslaved people had been confined, their bodies weakened and scarred from prolonged mistreatment. The air inside the room was thick with the stench of neglect, and the conditions were far worse than anyone could have imagined. Many of them were in a state of malnourishment, with signs of severe physical harm. The most harrowing discovery, however, was the apparatuses and tools that had been used to inflict pain. The evidence of intentional harm was undeniable makeshift restraints, chains, and devices that had no place in a household. It became clear that this was not a result of simple mistreatment, but something far more deliberate and cruel. Witnesses described the scene in hushed tones for years to come. The trauma they encountered was so intense that many struggled to find words to fully capture what they had seen. Those who had previously dismissed rumors about Madame Lalaurie's behavior could no longer turn a blind eye. The truth had been laid bare, and it was more horrific than anyone could have imagined. Madame Lalaurie, once a celebrated socialite, had harbored a darker side that had remained hidden for far too long. As the fire raged below, she attempted to maintain her composure, denying any knowledge of the atrocities uncovered in her home. But the evidence was overwhelming, and word spread quickly through the city. The genteel mask that she had worn for years was shattered in an instant. As the news of the discovery reached the streets, a wave of outrage swept through New Orleans. People who had once attended Lalaurie's lavish parties were now among the crowds demanding justice. The story of her cruelty spread like wildfire, and soon a mob gathered outside the mansion, their anger palpable. They called for her to be held accountable, but Madame Lalaurie, ever calculating, managed to flee the scene before she could face the wrath of the public. In the days following the fire, the Lalaurie mansion became a symbol of horror, a place where unspeakable suffering had taken place. It was said that the cries of those who had been harmed could still be heard within its walls, echoing through the now abandoned house. The building itself seemed to take on a life of its own, as if it had absorbed the pain and anguish that had occurred within. The authorities launched an investigation, but the damage had already been done. The full extent of Madame Lalaurie's actions could never be fully documented, as many of the enslaved people who had suffered under her care did not survive to tell their stories. For those who had been found alive, their recovery would be a long and painful process. The city grappled with the aftermath, struggling to come to terms with the fact that such cruelty had been happening right under their noses. Dr. Leonard Louis Lalaurie, her husband, had been absent during the fire, and there were conflicting reports about his involvement in the horrors that took place in the attic. Some claimed that he was complicit, turning a blind eye to his wife's actions, while others believed he was unaware of the full extent of her cruelty. Regardless of his role, the Lalaurie name was now synonymous with suffering, and both husband and wife vanished into obscurity, leaving behind only speculation about their fates. The city, meanwhile, had to contend with the aftermath. The mansion, now abandoned, stood as a reminder of the horrors that had taken place. Neighbors avoided the building, unwilling to go near the place that had become a symbol of such intense suffering. It was said that strange noises could be heard at night, faint whispers, the sound of footsteps and cries that seemed to echo through the empty rooms. Those who were brave enough to approach the mansion reported an overwhelming feeling of unease, as if the building itself was alive with the memories of what had occurred there. Over time, the Lalaurie mansion became more than just a physical structure. It became a dark legend, a story passed down through generations about the dangers of unchecked cruelty. The people of New Orleans, who had once celebrated the Lalaurie family, now spoke of them only in whispers, as if even mentioning their name might invite some dark force into their lives. For years after the fire, the mansion stood empty, its windows dark and its walls decaying. No one dared to live there, and it became a place of ghost stories and urban legends. People claimed to see figures in the windows, shadows that would disappear when approached, and lights that flickered at night, despite the house being uninhabited. As the years passed, the house became a site of fascination for those interested in the supernatural. Paranormal investigators, curious tourists, and even thrill-seekers flocked to the mansion, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ghosts that were said to haunt its halls. The house had taken on a life of its own, its dark history forever tied to the legend of Madame Lalaurie. But beneath the ghost stories and the sensational headlines, the true horror of the Lalaurie mansion remained rooted in the very real suffering of those who had been harmed there. Their voices, silenced for so long, were finally being heard, though only through the dark legacy of the building where they had lived and died. The Lalaurie mansion was no longer just a house. It was a testament to the horrors that humans could inflict upon one another. And though Madame Lalaurie had escaped justice in her lifetime, the echoes of her cruelty would continue to reverberate through the city of New Orleans for generations to come. When the Lalaurie mansion fell silent after the events of 1834, the once vibrant home now stood as a monument to human suffering. The horrors unearthed in the attic haunted the streets of New Orleans, and the city's residents grappled with the magnitude of what had occurred behind the mansion's elegant facade. Madame Delphine Lalaurie had vanished into the night, her name forever tarnished, but the scar she left behind remained deep and festering. In the weeks and months that followed the fire, rumors circulated about Madame Lalaurie's fate. Some believed she had fled to France, returning to the homeland of her ancestors to live out the rest of her days in exile. Others speculated that she had assumed a new identity and was hiding somewhere in the American South, far from the public eye. There were even whispers that she had met an untimely end, punished by some divine force for her unspeakable actions. But none of these rumors were ever confirmed. The truth about Delphine Lalaurie's final years remains one of the many mysteries surrounding her legacy. What was certain, however, was the immediate aftermath of the mansion itself. Once the flames were extinguished and the full extent of the suffering within its walls was revealed, the Lalaurie mansion became a place of infamy. The house, with its graceful architecture and prime location on Royal Street, should have been a coveted property, but its dark history cast a long shadow. No one wanted to live there. It was said that the very walls were tainted, that they had absorbed the cries of those who had suffered and could never be cleansed. The mansion stood empty for many years, its windows boarded up and its grand facade slowly deteriorating. Neighbors avoided walking past it, and the building became a source of superstitions. People claimed to hear strange noises coming from within the walls, muffled voices, eerie footsteps, and the unmistakable sound of sobbing. Even in the daylight, the mansion exuded an atmosphere of dread. It was as if the house itself was mourning the lives that had been lost within its walls. Over time, stories of a curse began to take hold. The house, some said, had been cursed by the souls of those who had suffered there. They believed that the spirits of the enslaved people who had endured unimaginable pain at the hands of Madame Lalaurie were still trapped within the mansion, unable to find peace. Visitors and passers-by reported seeing shadowy figures in the windows, even though the house was uninhabited. Others claimed to hear faint whispers, as if the spirits were crying out for justice that had never been delivered. As the legend of the curse grew, so did the mansion's reputation as a place of paranormal activity. In a city as steeped in supernatural lore as New Orleans, the Lalaurie mansion quickly became one of its most notorious haunted locations. It was said that those who dared to enter the house would feel an overwhelming sense of sorrow, a weight pressing down on them as they walked through its dark, empty halls. Some claimed to have seen the ghost of Madame Lalaurie herself, still wandering the mansion, forever bound to the place where she had caused so much suffering. Despite the fear that surrounded the mansion, it did not remain abandoned forever. The property changed hands several times over the years, with each new owner hoping to restore the building to its former glory. But no one stayed for long. Each time the house was sold, the new residents would quickly abandon it, citing strange occurrences and an oppressive, unsettling energy that made living there unbearable. Furniture would move on its own, doors would slam shut without warning, and cold spots would appear in rooms that had been warmed by the sun just moments before. The mansion seemed determined to drive away anyone who tried to make it their home. One of the most famous incidents occurred in the late 19th century, when the mansion was purchased by a wealthy businessman. Hoping to profit from the building's prime location, he turned the mansion into an apartment complex. But almost immediately, tenants began to report strange and disturbing experiences. Objects would disappear, only to reappear in bizarre places. Loud bangs and disembodied voices would wake them in the middle of the night. One tenant even claimed to have seen the ghostly figure of a woman dressed in an old-fashioned gown, standing at the foot of his bed. Needless to say, the apartment complex was not a success, and the building was once again abandoned. As the years passed, the mansion's reputation continued to grow. Stories of the hauntings attracted the attention of paranormal investigators, ghost hunters, and curious tourists alike. Some came hoping to catch a glimpse of the supernatural, while others were drawn by the dark history of Madame Lowry and the infamous attic where so much suffering had taken place. The mansion had become a macabre tourist attraction, a place where history and legend intertwined to create something both horrifying and fascinating. But beneath the sensational stories of hauntings and curses lay the true tragedy of the Lowry mansion, the suffering of those who had been harmed within its walls. Their voices, silenced by history, had been forgotten by many, overshadowed by the legend of the house itself. Yet the presence of their spirits, whether real or imagined, served as a reminder that the true horror of the Lowry mansion was not in the ghost stories, but in the very real human cruelty that had taken place there. In the decades after Madame Lowry's departure, the mansion became a symbol of the darker aspects of human nature. It was a reminder that even in the most beautiful places, there can be darkness hidden beneath the surface. The curse of the Lowry mansion, it seemed, was not just a supernatural affliction, but a reflection of the deep scars left by the cruelty that had been inflicted there. As the years turned into decades and then centuries, the Lowry mansion remained a focal point of intrigue and fear. Each new owner, whether skeptical or superstitious, could not escape the house's dark history. The building itself seemed to resist any attempt to erase its past, as if the very stones had absorbed the horror of what had taken place. And so, the legend of the Lowry mansion continued to grow, its place in the annals of New Orleans' haunted history cemented forever. Though the mansion still stands today, restored and preserved, it remains shrouded in mystery. Many believe that the spirits of those who suffered there are still trapped within its walls, unable to move on. The building's grand appearance belies the darkness that lingers inside, a reminder that some wounds can never truly heal, and some stories are too tragic to forget. As the years passed and the events of 1834 faded from living memory, the Lowry mansion slowly transitioned from a house of horrors to a site of fascination for those drawn to the mysterious and unexplained. New Orleans, a city already known for its deep connection to the supernatural, found in the Lowry mansion one of its most infamous landmarks. The mansion's dark history, entwined with tales of tragedy and cruelty, made it a magnet for ghost hunters, paranormal enthusiasts, and curious visitors from around the world. By the early 20th century, the mansion had changed hands numerous times, with each owner attempting, and inevitably failing, to restore the building to its former grandeur. The house, beautiful though it was, carried an unmistakable aura, an energy that made even the bravest of souls uneasy. Many owners found themselves facing more than just the challenge of restoring a historic property. They faced the mansion's reputation, and for some, the belief that the house was haunted proved to be too much. For decades, people reported strange happenings in and around the mansion. From unexplained noises to mysterious apparitions, the stories that emerged from the Lowry mansion seemed to confirm what many had long suspected, that the house had never truly been free of its tragic past. Reports of ghostly figures roaming the halls were common, and visitors often claimed to feel a deep, oppressive presence when they entered the house. One of the most frequently reported phenomena was the sighting of a woman believed to be Madame Delphine Lowry herself. Dressed in a period gown, her figure was said to appear suddenly in various parts of the mansion, sometimes near the grand staircase, other times in the ballroom where she once entertained New Orleans' elite. Her presence, many believed, was not a comforting one. Those who claimed to have seen her often described an overwhelming sense of dread, as if they were in the presence of someone capable of unspeakable acts. Some visitors even reported feeling an inexplicable coldness whenever they approached the area where her ghost was said to appear. But it wasn't just Madame Lowry who was believed to haunt the mansion. Many believed that the spirits of the enslaved people who had suffered under her cruel hand were also still trapped within the walls of the house. The attic, where the most horrifying discoveries had been made, was the site of numerous paranormal experiences. Visitors reported hearing faint cries and whispers, as if the spirits of those who had endured so much pain were still calling out for help. Some even claimed to feel invisible hands brushing against them or pulling at their clothing, as though the spirits were trying to make contact with the living. Despite the growing number of paranormal reports, the Lalaurie Mansion continued to attract attention. Its status as one of the most haunted locations in New Orleans only increased its allure. Television shows, books, and documentaries exploring the mansion's dark past and ghostly activity brought even more attention to the already infamous house. Paranormal investigators flocked to the site, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural. Some claimed to have recorded strange voices on their equipment, disembodied voices that seemed to cry out in pain or confusion. Others took photographs that showed unexplained shadows or eerie orbs of light hovering in the air. Over time, the Lalaurie Mansion became not just a place where history had been made, but a key location in the folklore of the city. Locals and tourists alike whispered about the house, trading stories of their own eerie encounters or tales they had heard from friends and family. The mansion had become more than just a physical building. It was a living legend, a place where the boundary between the past and the present, between the living and the dead, seemed to blur. For many, the mansion represented the darker side of New Orleans history. While the city was known for its vibrant culture, music, and festivals, the Lalaurie Mansion was a reminder that even the most beautiful places could hold dark secrets. The house, with its elegant architecture and prime location in the French Quarter, was a symbol of the extremes of wealth and power that had once defined New Orleans society. Yet beneath its beauty lay a history of cruelty, one that could never be fully erased. As paranormal activity around the mansion grew more notorious, so did the house's reputation as a dangerous place. Visitors who entered the mansion often described feelings of nausea, dizziness, or overwhelming sadness. Some even claimed that the mansion had a malevolent energy, that the spirits within were not simply restless, but angry, perhaps vengeful. Over the years, more extreme accounts emerged. People reported being physically harmed while inside the house, scratches appearing on their arms or legs, or even being shoved by unseen forces. These incidents only added to the legend of the mansion, making it seem like a place where the past continued to assert its power over the present. By the mid-20th century, the Lalaurie Mansion had become a fixture in New Orleans ghost tours. Guides would lead groups past the house, recounting its grisly history and the terrifying encounters that had taken place within. For many tourists, the Lalaurie Mansion was the highlight of their trip, an opportunity to get as close as possible to one of the most haunted locations in America. The house became an essential stop for anyone interested in the supernatural, and its dark reputation only grew with time. Yet for all the stories of hauntings and ghosts, there was also a deeper legacy at play. The Lalaurie Mansion, with its history of suffering, forced the city to confront a part of its past that was often overlooked. The cruelty inflicted upon the enslaved people who lived and worked in the mansion was not just an isolated incident, but part of a larger, darker history that had shaped New Orleans and the American South. The house, haunted though it may be, stood as a reminder of the human cost of greed, cruelty, and unchecked power. In recent years, the mansion has once again been restored, with new owners taking great care to preserve its historical significance. Yet despite the renovations, the aura of the house remains unchanged. Visitors continue to report strange occurrences, and the mansion's reputation as a haunted house remains as strong as ever. For many, the Lalaurie Mansion will always be more than just a historic building. It will remain a place where the past refuses to stay buried, where the spirits of those who suffered continue to make their presence known. Whether the Lalaurie mansion is truly haunted or whether its reputation is the result of centuries of storytelling and fear, one thing is certain: the legacy of the house is deeply intertwined with the history of New Orleans. It is a place where the weight of the past is felt in every corner, where the walls seem to whisper of forgotten tragedies, and where the line between the living and the dead is as thin as the fog that often rolls in from the Mississippi River. In the 21st century, the Lalaurie Mansion stands as a paradox, a symbol of both history and legend, fact and myth, beauty and horror. The world may have moved on from the events of 1834, but the mansion itself remains a physical embodiment of those dark days, forever linked to its infamous past. Despite the modern renovations and the shifting landscape of New Orleans, the mansion continues to capture the public's imagination like few other places in America. Today, the Lalaurie Mansion is not just a historical landmark. It has become a cornerstone of popular culture, a setting for numerous films, television shows, and books, all exploring the darker corners of the human psyche. Whether portrayed in dramas, thrillers, or supernatural tales, the mansion's story is retold time and time again, each version adding a new layer to its already complex mythology. One of the most notable examples of this is its inclusion in American horror stories, where the mansion's history is fictionalized and reimagined for modern audiences, though always with an air of eerie realism that echoes the true horrors of its past. The fascination with the Lalaurie Mansion extends far beyond the borders of New Orleans. Ghost tours and paranormal investigations have been featured in documentaries and online content, drawing viewers who are captivated by the idea of a real-life haunted house. Every year, thousands of tourists flock to the city, eager to catch a glimpse of the place where history and the supernatural intertwine. Standing in front of the mansion's elegant facade, it's easy to forget that behind those walls, untold pain once occurred. And that's exactly what makes it so enticing for those intrigued by the macabre. For some, the Lalaurie Mansion is more than just a tourist attraction. It's a portal into the mysteries of the afterlife. Paranormal investigators have spent years documenting their findings, hoping to provide proof of what so many have claimed to experience firsthand. Some investigators enter the mansion armed with cutting-edge technology, thermal cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and voice recorders designed to capture sounds inaudible to the human ear. What they find often defies explanation. Shadows dart across empty rooms. Temperatures drop inexplicably, and strange, disembodied voices are captured on audio. Some investigators have even reported feeling physically touched by unseen hands, reinforcing the belief that the mansion is more than just haunted. It's alive with an otherworldly energy. Despite the numerous investigations, there has never been definitive proof that the mansion is haunted. Skeptics argue that the stories surrounding the house are nothing more than folklore, exaggerated by decades of retellings and the city's love for ghost stories. But for every skeptic, there is someone who has experienced something unexplainable, something that suggests that the mansion's dark. History has left an indelible mark on the present. One of the most perplexing mysteries surrounding the Lalaurie Mansion is the fate of Madame Delphine Lalaurie herself. While the general consensus is that she fled New Orleans after the fire, her exact whereabouts after her escape remains shrouded in mystery. Some believe she fled to France, living out her final years in anonymity, while others claim she never left Louisiana at all. There are even rumors that she returned to New Orleans in secret, blending into the city's society under a false identity. Although many have searched for definitive answers, none have been found, leaving her ultimate fate one of the mansion's most enduring mysteries. As for the mansion itself, its future seems just as uncertain as its past. Despite its renovations and modern use, there remains an undeniable sense that the house is still tied to the past, as though it cannot escape the horrors that once occurred within its walls. Those who live near the mansion often report strange happenings, lights flickering in the windows, unexplained sounds late at night, and an unsettling feeling that they are being watched. Even after all these years, the mansion continues to captivate and terrify in equal measure. The people of New Orleans, long accustomed to the city's rich tapestry of supernatural tales, often treat the Lalaurie mansion with a mixture of reverence and fear. For some, it's simply part of the city's history, a tragic chapter that reflects the darker aspects of humanity. For others, it's a warning, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and cruelty. And for many, it's a place to avoid altogether, a site too steeped in sorrow and suffering to be approached lightly. Yet for all the terror associated with the mansion, it has also become a place of reflection. In recent years, more attention has been paid to the true victims of the Lalaurie mansion, the enslaved men, women, and children who suffered at the hands of Madame Lalaurie. Their stories, long overshadowed by the legend of the mansion itself, are slowly being brought to the forefront. Exhibits and historical tours now make a concerted effort to honor the lives that were lost and to tell the fuller, more nuanced story of the mansion's past. In many ways, the Lalaurie mansion has come to represent the complexity of New Orleans itself, a city where beauty and tragedy often go hand in hand, and where the weight of history is felt in every corner. The mansion, with its grand architecture and dark legacy, stands as a testament to the city's resilience, but also as a reminder of the cruelty and suffering that once lurked behind its closed doors. It is both a symbol of the horrors of the past and a cautionary tale about the dangers of forgetting history. Even as the mansion continues to evolve, whether as a private residence, a tourist destination, or a historical landmark, it remains a place of unanswered questions. Is it truly haunted? Will the spirits that are said to inhabit its halls ever find peace? And will the true story of Madame Lalaurie's life and crimes ever be fully uncovered? The Lalaurie mansion, with its dark past and uncertain future, stands at the intersection of history and myth, a place where the lines between the living and the dead are forever blurred. And as long as it remains standing, it will continue to fascinate, terrify, and captivate those who dare to look beyond its elegant exterior and confront the chilling truths that lie within. The mansion's tale, though centuries old, is far from over. As new generations discover the story of Madame Lalaurie and her house of horrors, the legend will continue to grow, ensuring that the Lalaurie mansion remains one of the most haunting and mysterious locations in all of New Orleans, a place where the past never truly dies, and where the echoes of its dark history continue to reverberate through time. The Myrtles Plantation, nestled in the deep south of Louisiana, stands as a relic of an era long past, an architectural monument woven with tales of mystery and tragedy. Its majestic oak trees, draped with moss, form an eerie canopy over the estate, a picturesque yet haunting sight. But beneath its serene facade lies a history soaked in sorrow, conflict, and unsettling events that would ultimately birth one of the most famous haunted sites in America. Built in 1796 by General David Bradford, a prominent figure involved in the Whiskey Rebellion, the Myrtles Plantation was initially named Laurel Grove. Bradford, fleeing from Pennsylvania after his involvement in the rebellion, sought refuge in the dense Louisiana wilderness. The isolation of the plantation gave him the safety he needed while living as a fugitive, and soon, Laurel Grove became his retreat from the law. Bradford lived quietly, cultivating his land and maintaining a relatively peaceful existence away from the conflicts that had defined much of his early life. However, this peace was short-lived. After receiving a presidential pardon, Bradford was able to resume his life in the public eye. He brought his family to the plantation, expanding it into a larger, more profitable estate. The plantation thrived in the early 1800s, largely due to the labor of enslaved people who worked tirelessly on the land. As was the case with many southern plantations, the prosperity of the Myrtles was built upon the backs of those enslaved, whose names and lives were often erased from history. While the wealth of the estate grew, so did the darker undercurrents that would later manifest in tragic ways. David Bradford's daughter, Sarah Matilda, would eventually marry Judge Clark Woodruff, a man whose influence and ambition brought further success to the plantation. However, prosperity did not shield the Myrtles from the tragedies that awaited. Sarah and Clark's 3 children would not escape the dark fate that loomed over the estate. The Woodruffs faced unspeakable heartbreak, with 2 of their children passing at a young age, casting a shadow over what had once been a place of refuge. The loss of the children marked the beginning of what some believe was the plantation's descent into despair. At the time, life in the South was harsh, with diseases such as yellow fever and cholera sweeping through the region, claiming countless lives. The Woodruff family, despite their status, was not immune to these grim realities. But it wasn't just illness that led to the sorrow surrounding the Myrtles plantation. The 19th century was rife with conflict, and as the tensions between the North and South grew, so too did the unrest within the plantation itself. The enslaved individuals who worked on the estate lived under brutal conditions, and their suffering, though largely hidden from the official records, added to the mounting darkness that seemed to envelop the land. By the time of the Civil War, the plantation was no longer under the ownership of the Bradford Woodruff family, having changed hands multiple times. However, the conflicts of the era did not spare the Myrtles from further tragedy. During the war, the plantation was reportedly looted by Union soldiers, who left behind even more devastation in their wake. The once thriving estate became a place of ruin, and the stories of suffering only grew. As the South struggled to rebuild in the years following the Civil War, the Myrtles plantation stood as a symbol of both the old world and the new. Reconstruction brought changes to the region, but the ghost of the past, both figuratively and literally, continued to linger in the halls of the plantation. The violence and pain endured during those years left an indelible mark on the land, one that many believe gave rise to the paranormal activity that would later make the Myrtles famous. Though often overlooked in the retelling of the Myrtles plantation's history, the lives of the enslaved people who lived and worked on the estate cannot be ignored. Their stories, full of pain and hardship, are integral to understanding the atmosphere of unrest that pervaded the plantation. While the legends of ghosts and spirits dominate the modern narrative, the real lives of these individuals form the tragic foundation upon which these tales were built. Slavery on the plantation was a brutal reality. Those who worked the land endured long hours of hard labor, abuse, and an existence defined by oppression. The names of most of these individuals have been lost to time, but their suffering remains a key part of the Myrtles' tragic history. Many believe that the unrest of the enslaved continues to manifest in the paranormal occurrences that have been reported over the years. By the late 1800s, the Myrtles plantation had undergone several more ownership changes, each bringing new stories and new tragedies. It was during this period that the legends of hauntings truly began to take hold. Visitors to the estate started reporting strange sightings, from ghostly apparitions to unexplained noises in the night. These early accounts were often dismissed as superstition, yet the stories persisted. The plantation's dark history, coupled with its eerie atmosphere, made it fertile ground for tales of the supernatural. Over time, the Myrtles plantation's reputation as a haunted site grew, attracting both skeptics and believers alike. The plantation itself, despite its beauty and historical significance, seemed forever shrouded in a sense of unease. The land, once a symbol of prosperity, had become a place where past and present collided, with the stories of those who had suffered there refusing to fade away. Of all the eerie tales that have come to define the haunted legacy of the Myrtles plantation, None is as famous or as chilling as the story of Chloe. The legend of Chloe, an enslaved woman who lived and worked on the plantation, weaves together themes of betrayal, fear, and ultimately, tragedy. Over the years, her story has taken on a life of its own, immortalizing her as one of the most well-known spirits said to haunt the grounds. The legend begins with Chloe's arrival at the Myrtles plantation, though the details of how she came to be there have been lost to time. Some say Chloe was brought to the estate as a young woman, while others claim she had been there for years. What all versions of the story agree on is that Chloe worked inside the main house, serving as a maid to the plantation owner's family. By this point, Judge Clark Woodruff had taken over the estate after marrying David Bradford's daughter, Sarah Matilda. Chloe was said to be a trusted servant, one who had gained a degree of favor within the household. She was responsible for attending to the personal needs of the family, often assisting with the children. However, it is here that the story takes a darker turn, as rumors began to swirl about Chloe's relationship with Judge Woodruff. One of the most pervasive elements of Chloe's tale is the suggestion of an affair between her and the judge. Some versions of the story claim that Chloe had been coerced into the relationship, fearing for her safety and her position within the household. Other tellings paint a more ambiguous picture, with Chloe using her knowledge of the judge's personal life to her advantage, attempting to secure her place within the estate. Regardless of the exact nature of the relationship, the affair eventually came to light. According to legend, when Sarah Matilda discovered Chloe's involvement with her husband, she responded with anger and retribution. Fearing for her life, Chloe began to eavesdrop on the family's private conversations, hoping to learn what fate awaited her. In some accounts, Chloe was caught listening at a keyhole, an act that led to her being punished. It was during this time that Chloe's story took its most tragic and fateful turn. Chloe's fear of being cast out or punished escalated, leading her to make a desperate and disastrous decision. In an attempt to regain favor with the family, Chloe devised a plan to sicken them, hoping she could later provide the cure and earn their gratitude. She baked a cake, lacing it with a toxic substance thought to be oleander leaves. The plan went horribly wrong. Instead of a mild illness, Sarah Matilda and two of her children fell gravely ill after eating the poisoned cake. Within days, they had passed away, their sudden death shrouding the plantation in grief. Chloe, realizing the enormity of her mistake, was consumed with panic. The household was thrown into mourning, and Chloe's role in the tragedy was quickly discovered. Whether through her own confession or a suspicion of others, the outcome was inevitable. The aftermath of the poisoning was swift and brutal. The other enslaved individuals on the plantation, fearful of the consequences that might befall them all, took matters into their own hands. According to legend, Chloe was dragged into the yard and, in a desperate act of self-preservation, was executed by hanging. Her body was then disposed of, cast into the nearby Mississippi River, her life extinguished in a moment of collective fury. But the story of Chloe did not end with her death. Over the years, her spirit has been said to linger at the Myrtles plantation, an enduring presence tied to the tragedy she had a hand in causing. The legend of Chloe's ghost began shortly after her passing. Visitors and residents of the plantation reported seeing a figure of a woman, dressed in a green turban, standing quietly in the shadows of the house. Her apparition would often appear near the spot where she had once stood as a servant, and her face haunted and sorrowful was a reminder of the events that had unfolded there. Many believe that Chloe's spirit has remained tethered to the Myrtles as a result of the violent and unjust manner of her death. She is often described as a restless ghost, one whose presence can be felt in both the light of day and the dead of night. Some claim to have seen her peering through windows, her eyes filled with regret, while others have heard the faint sound of footsteps trailing through the halls, always near the rooms where the poisoning took place. One of the most famous pieces of evidence supporting the existence of Chloe's ghost is a photograph taken in the 1990s. In the image, a figure that resembles Chloe can be seen standing between two buildings, dressed in a long skirt and a headscarf. The photo has been widely debated, with some dismissing it as a trick of the light, while others insist it is proof of the supernatural. Over time, Chloe's legend has grown, with many retellings casting her as a symbol of regret and the consequences of poor choices. Her story, while rooted in tragedy, is also a cautionary tale, one that warns of the dangers of manipulation and betrayal. But for May, Chloe is more than just a ghostly figure. She represents the unresolved tensions of the past, particularly the injustices faced by enslaved individuals like her. While the details of Chloe's life and the events leading to her death remain murky, the power of her story lies in its ability to capture the imagination. It serves as a reminder of the human toll of the era's harsh realities, where lives were often defined by fear and desperation. In recent years, historians and paranormal investigators have tried to separate fact from fiction when it comes to Chloe's story. Some have suggested that there is no historical record of an enslaved woman named Chloe, nor any evidence that Sarah Matilda and her children died of poisoning. Instead, they argue, the family may have succumbed to one of the many illnesses that plagued the South during that time. Yet, the lack of historical documentation has done little to diminish the legend. The story of Chloe, whether grounded in truth or folklore, remains a key part of the Myrtles Plantation's haunted legacy. Her ghost is one of the most frequently reported spirits on the property, and many who visit the plantation still claim to feel her presence. In the end, Chloe's tale is one of the most enduring aspects of the Myrtles Plantation, a story passed down through generations, shaping the reputation of the estate as a place where the past continues to walk among the living. The Myrtles Plantation is not just a historic landmark. It is a place where the past feels unsettlingly close. Over the years, countless visitors, residents, and staff have reported encounters with the unexplained. Whether it's the soft sound of footsteps echoing through empty halls, a sudden chill in the air, or full-bodied apparitions appearing in broad daylight, the plantation's haunted reputation is built upon years of strange and eerie events. The supernatural experiences at Myrtles span generations, drawing believers and skeptics alike to its haunted halls. Those who spend time at the Myrtles Plantation often report that the house feels as if it is never truly empty. From the moment one steps onto the creaking wooden floors, there is a palpable sense of being watched, an invisible presence lingering just out of sight. This feeling has been described by both guests and employees of the plantation, many of whom had no prior knowledge of the estate's haunted history when they arrived. The apparitions seen at the Myrtles vary widely, ranging from faint outlines to fully formed figures. The most common sightings are that of Chloe, whose spirit is said to still roam the grounds. But Chloe is not the only ghost who haunts the plantation. Numerous other spirits have been seen and felt by visitors, each with its own story tied to the tragic past of the estate. One of the most frequently told ghost stories revolves around the spirits of two young girls, believed to be the children of Judge Clark Woodruff and Sarah Matilda. After their tragic deaths, many believe their souls never left the Myrtles. Guests have reported seeing the ghostly figures of children playing in the hallways, laughing softly as they run through the house. Some have even claimed to hear their faint voices at night, calling out to each other or to their long-departed mother. In one chilling account, a guest staying in one of the upstairs bedrooms awoke to the sound of giggling, only to find the figures of two small girls standing at the foot of the bed. The figures vanished as soon as the guest sat up, leaving behind a cold spot that lingered long after the encounter. Others have reported hearing the sound of children's footsteps in rooms that were supposed to be empty. These apparitions are not confined to the inside of the house. Many have reported seeing the children playing in the garden, their dresses billowing in the breeze as they move about the grounds. The sightings of these young girls serve as a haunting reminder of the family's tragic loss, and they are often seen as benevolent spirits, their presence more sorrowful than malevolent. One of the most well-known supernatural objects at the Myrtles plantation is a large, ornate mirror that hangs in the main hallway. According to legend, this mirror holds the spirits of Sarah Matilda and her children, trapped within its reflective surface after their deaths. In the years since, visitors have reported seeing strange, ghostly images appear in the mirror handprints, faces, and figures that seem to press up against the glass as if trying to escape. It is said that despite frequent cleanings, handprints reappear on the mirror, always in the same spots. Some guests have even claimed to see Sarah Matilda's face staring back at them from the mirror, her expression filled with grief. This haunting relic has become one of the plantation's most famous supernatural attractions, and many who visit the Myrtles make it a point to take a closer look, hoping to catch a glimpse of the otherworldly figures rumored to be trapped inside. The Myrtles plantation is also home to a mysterious piano that seems to have a life of its own. Late at night, when the house is quiet and still, the sound of music can sometimes be heard drifting through the air. Guests and staff have reported hearing the piano's keys being played, even when no one is near it. The melody is often described as soft and melancholy, a ghostly tune that echoes through the otherwise silent house. In some instances, the piano has been seen moving on its own, with the lid slowly lifting and falling as if someone were about to play. Guests who have stayed in rooms near the parlor have been awakened by the eerie sound of the piano playing faintly in the distance. Upon investigation, they find the room empty and the piano undisturbed. This mysterious phenomenon has baffled visitors and paranormal investigators alike, with no clear explanation for why the piano continues to play on its own. Some believe it is the work of one of the many spirits who roam the plantation, perhaps a former resident who enjoyed playing music in life and continues to do so in death. The grand staircase of the Myrtles plantation is a focal point for many paranormal encounters. One of the most frequently seen spirits is that of a woman dressed in antebellum attire, often described as wearing a long, flowing dress. She is most often seen descending the stairs, her hand lightly brushing the banister as she moves silently downward. Guests have reported seeing this apparition both during the day and at night, though she never acknowledges their presence. She seems to be in her own world, reliving a moment from long ago. Some believe this woman is the ghost of Sarah Matilda, forever bound to the house where she met such a tragic fate. Others think she may be a former resident or even a visitor from another era. The sightings of this spectral figure are so frequent that many employees have become accustomed to seeing her out of the corner of their eye, only to look up and find her gone. Her presence is not considered threatening, but rather a sad, silent reminder of the plantation's haunted past. In addition to the sightings of full-bodied apparitions, visitors to the Myrtles plantation frequently report hearing unexplained noises throughout the house. Footsteps are often heard on the upper floors when no one is there, and doors are known to open and close on their own. Disembodied voices, often faint and unintelligible, have been reported in the hallways and bedrooms, as if the spirits of the plantation are continuing their conversations from another time. Shadows, too, seem to move on their own within the house. Guests have described seeing dark, human-shaped figures darting across the walls, only to disappear when approached. These shadows are often seen in the corners of rooms or at the end of hallways, adding to the sense that the Myrtles is a place where the past refuses to stay buried. Another spirit that reportedly haunts the plantation is that of a Confederate soldier. Visitors have seen the figure of a man in a gray uniform walking the grounds, his face stern and focused. He's often seen near the front of the house or by the plantation's gates, as if standing guard. Some believe this spirit may be a remnant from the Civil War, when the Myrtles was looted by Union soldiers. The soldier has never been known to interact with visitors, disappearing as quickly as he is seen. His presence, though fleeting, adds to the eerie atmosphere of the plantation, reminding guests of the many lives that have passed through the estate over the centuries. Over the years, the Myrtles plantation has attracted numerous paranormal investigators, ghost hunters, and curious tourists hoping to document the supernatural. One of the most famous pieces of evidence to come from the plantation is a photograph taken in the 1990s. The image shows what appears to be the figure of a woman standing between two buildings on the property. Dressed in old-fashioned clothing, the figure bears a striking resemblance to the descriptions of Chloe, the plantation's most famous ghost. This photo has been widely analyzed and debated, with some believing it to be undeniable proof of the Myrtles' haunted nature, while others dismiss it as a trick of the light or a case of mistaken identity. Regardless of the explanation, the photo has become a symbol of the supernatural activity at the plantation, drawing even more attention to its ghostly reputation. The Myrtles plantation's reputation as one of America's most haunted locations has attracted paranormal investigators, ghost hunters, and curious thrill seekers for decades. With so many stories of ghostly encounters, strange happenings, and eerie sounds, it was only a matter of time before modern technology was employed to try to capture proof of the supernatural. This chapter delves into the various investigations that have taken place at the plantation and the chilling experiences reported by visitors in recent years. The paranormal interest in Myrtles plantation grew steadily throughout the 20th century, particularly as stories of Chloe and other apparitions circulated more widely. As television shows focusing on hauntings and the paranormal began to gain popularity in the 1990s and early 2000s, the plantation became a frequent subject of investigation. Numerous paranormal teams have visited the site, bringing with them advanced equipment in the hopes of documenting the mysterious occurrences the visitors have been reporting for generations. These investigations have often yielded unsettling results, from eerie audio recordings to unexplained video footage. The plantation has been featured on several high-profile paranormal television shows, which have further cemented its status as a ghost hunting hotspot. However, despite the many investigations, the question remains, are the spirits of the Myrtles real, or are they the product of vivid imaginations and heightened emotions? One of the most commonly reported forms of evidence at the Myrtles plantation is the capture of EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, unexplained sounds or voices that are typically recorded but not heard by the human ear at the time. Investigators have claimed to capture chilling EVPs throughout the plantation, including voices that seem to respond directly to questions. In one investigation, an EVP was recorded in the main hallway near the infamous mirror. When asked if there were any spirits present, a faint voice can be heard whispering, "I'm here." Others have captured sounds of children laughing, which some believe to be the ghostly echoes of the Woodruff children who perished after the alleged poisoning. Many of these recordings are faint and difficult to interpret, but they add to the growing body of evidence that suggests the plantation is far from an ordinary historical site. Some investigators have also reported hearing disembodied voices during their time at the Myrtles. These voices, though not captured on recording devices, have been described as soft whispers, as if someone is speaking from a distant room. These auditory phenomena often occur in the late hours of the night when the house is quiet and empty, further adding to the eerie atmosphere. Another tool frequently used by paranormal investigators is the EMF, electromagnetic field detector, which measures fluctuations in electromagnetic energy. The theory behind its use in ghost hunting is that spirits may emit or disrupt electromagnetic fields, causing the devices to spike in areas where there is no obvious source of interference. At the Myrtles plantation, investigators have reported strange EMF readings, particularly around the staircase and in the bedrooms where many of the hauntings are said to occur. One investigation showed a sudden spike in EMF levels near the grand staircase, the very spot where the lady on the stairs has been seen. Despite thoroughly checking the area for any logical explanation, such as wiring or electronic devices, no cause for the sudden fluctuations was found. These readings are often cited as evidence that something paranormal is occurring, though skeptics argue that EMF spikes can be caused by a variety of natural sources. Still, the consistency with which these anomalies occur in specific areas of the house lends credence to the theory that the plantation is home to something otherworldly. Many visitors to the Myrtles plantation have reported seeing shadowy figures moving through the halls, often darting out of sight just as they are noticed. These shadow figures, sometimes described as human-shaped but featureless, have become a hallmark of the plantation's paranormal activity. Some investigators have captured these shadowy movements on video, though the footage is often grainy and difficult to interpret. In one famous instance, a team recorded what appeared to be a dark figure crossing the hallway, only to disappear into the wall. Upon reviewing the footage, no explanation for the figure could be found, leading many to believe that this was one of the plantation's many restless spirits. In addition to shadow figures, strange orbs of light have also been frequently reported. These orbs are often seen floating near the ceilings or drifting through rooms, their origins unknown. Some have speculated that these lights are manifestations of spirits, while others believe they may be caused by reflections or camera artifacts. Regardless of their cause, the lights add another layer of mystery to the already haunted reputation of the Myrtles. Even outside of official investigations, everyday visitors to the Myrtles plantation continue to report their own unsettling encounters. Some visitors have claimed to feel a sudden cold breeze pass by them, even when all the windows are closed. Others report feeling a distinct pressure on their chest, as though someone is standing too close, watching them. These sensations are often accompanied by a deep sense of unease, or the feeling that they are not alone, even in an empty room. A frequent experience recounted by guests is the sudden malfunction of electronic devices. Cameras and phones often drain unexpectedly, or photographs come out distorted. Some have even reported taking photos that reveal strange anomalies, lights, blurs, or misty figures that were not visible when the picture was taken. These technical disturbances have been attributed to the spirits of the plantation interfering with the devices. Those skeptics argue that these issues are likely due to the age of the building or environmental factors. One particularly eerie story involves a guest who stayed overnight in one of the plantation's rooms. In the early hours of the morning, they awoke to find the figure of a woman standing at the foot of their bed, her face hidden in the shadows. Believing it to be a member of the staff, the guest called out, only to see the figure slowly vanish into thin air. Needless to say, the guest did not sleep for the rest of the night. While the Myrtles plantation has earned its reputation as a paranormal hotspot, there are many who remain skeptical of the ghostly claims. Skeptics argue that many of the so-called paranormal experiences can be explained by natural causes. The age of the plantation, with its creaky floors and drafty rooms, may contribute to the eerie atmosphere. The strange noises and cold spots could be the result of the house settling or changes in air pressure, and the shadowy figures could simply be tricks of the light in the dimly lit halls. Some historians have also pointed out that much of the plantation's ghostly lore, particularly the story of Chloe, may be more legend than fact. There are no historical records that confirm Chloe's existence, and the Woodruff family's deaths, often attributed to poisoning, were likely caused by illness common in the 19th century South. Despite these efforts to debunk the hauntings, the stories continue to capture the imagination of those who visit. For every skeptic, there are countless others who leave the Myrtles plantation convinced they've experienced something unexplainable. Whether it's the power of suggestion, a heightened sense of awareness, or genuine encounters with the paranormal, the experiences of visitors contribute to the enduring legacy of the plantation as a place where the past feels all too close. Ultimately, The Myrtles Plantation's haunted reputation is as much a part of its identity as its architectural beauty or historical significance. The ghost stories that have developed over the years, whether based in fact or fiction, have become an integral part of what draws people to this remote corner of Louisiana. Visitors arrive hoping to experience the supernatural for themselves, to walk the halls where the past seems to linger, and to maybe catch a glimpse of something beyond the ordinary. In this way, the Myrtles Plantation is more than just a historic estate. It is a living legend. The stories of ghosts, mysterious occurrences, and tragic spirits have become entwined with the very fabric of the house, turning it into a place where history and folklore meet. The Myrtles Plantation is not just a relic of Southern history, nor simply a famous haunted house. It's a place where the past, both historical and paranormal, intertwines with the present. Over the years, its reputation has grown from that of an ordinary historical estate to a site of intense public fascination, largely due to its chilling ghost stories and the mysterious aura that surrounds it. As the story of the Myrtles has evolved, so has its cultural significance. This chapter examines the lasting impact of the plantation's haunted history on its community, its visitors, and popular culture. The haunting of the Myrtles Plantation has drawn thousands of visitors from around the world. What began as a historical curiosity has transformed into a major tourist destination, with people eager to experience the eerie charm of this plantation firsthand. The combination of history and the supernatural has made it one of the most visited and talked about haunted sites in the United States. Tours of the Myrtles have become one of its primary sources of income, with special attention given to the haunted aspects of the property. Visitors are regaled with stories of Chloe, the lady on the stairs, the ghost children, and the mysterious mirror. The plantation offers both daytime tours, focused more on its historical significance, and nighttime ghost tours, which attract those with a keen interest in the paranormal. The latter is often described as a spine-chilling experience, as guests are guided through dimly lit halls, encouraged to stay alert for signs of the supernatural. For many who visit, the allure of the Myrtles lies in the possibility of experiencing something unexplainable. Even for those who leave without seeing a ghost, the ambience of the old plantation, with its creaking floors, aged walls, and dark history, creates a sense of mystery that lingers long after they've left. It's this atmosphere that keeps people coming back, hoping for a fleeting encounter with the unknown. The Myrtles Plantation's haunted reputation has seeped into popular culture. Over the years, it has been featured in countless books, television shows, documentaries, and films, each contributing to the plantation's growing mystique. It's a frequent stop on lists of America's most haunted places, and its stories are retold in ghost books, podcasts, and documentaries about haunted locations. Shows like Unsolved Mysteries, Ghost Adventures, and Ghost Hunters have explored the Myrtles, bringing its haunted history into millions of living rooms across the world. These programs typically focus on the plantation's most famous spirits, like Chloe and the ghostly children, and attempt to capture evidence of the supernatural. While skeptics question the authenticity of such shows, their influence on the Myrtles' legacy cannot be denied. Each investigation, each retelling of the plantation's haunted tales, has added another layer to the mythology of the Myrtles. Beyond paranormal TV shows, the Myrtles has also inspired works of fiction. Authors have drawn upon the plantation's haunting legacy, weaving its ghost stories into novels and short stories. The Myrtles has come to symbolize not just a haunted house, but a quintessential Southern ghost story, where history and folklore mix with the eerie atmosphere of a grand old estate. The influence of the Myrtles Plantation has also permeated local culture. The surrounding community, though aware of the supernatural stories, views the plantation with a mixture of pride and curiosity. For many locals, the Myrtles is both a link to the area's history and a constant reminder of the South's complex and painful past. While some embrace the haunted reputation as a point of local intrigue, others prefer to focus on the plantation's role in history, emphasizing its architectural and cultural significance. With the increasing interest in the paranormal, the owners and caretakers of the Myrtles plantation have worked to preserve not only its historical significance, but also its ghostly legacy. The current owners are keenly aware that the plantation's haunted reputation is a major draw for visitors, and they've embraced it as part of the plantation's identity. In doing so, they've taken steps to ensure that the stories of the plantation spirits continue to be told while maintaining the authenticity and historical accuracy of the estate. Preservation efforts at the Myrtles include maintaining the house in its original 18th and 19th century condition, allowing visitors to step back in time as they tour the estate. The caretakers have worked to strike a delicate balance between honoring the historical importance of the plantation and capitalizing on its haunted reputation. Historical plaques and informational guides focus on the plantation's architecture, its role in the South, and the families who live there, while tours emphasize the ghost stories that have made the Myrtles famous. As part of their preservation efforts, the owners have also been open to paranormal research teams visiting the plantation. These teams often use the latest technology in ghost hunting, from thermal cameras to audio recorders, in an attempt to document the unexplained phenomena that continue to fascinate visitors. By allowing these investigations to continue, the Myrtles plantation remains at the forefront of paranormal research, further solidifying its status as one of the most haunted places in the United States. At its core, the Myrtles plantation is a place where history and hauntings are intertwined. The stories of its spirits are inextricably linked to the tragedies and hardships endured by those who lived and worked there. Whether it's the ghost of Chloe, said to be trapped in an endless cycle of guilt, or the spirits of the Woodruff children, forever bound to the house they once called home, the hauntings of the Myrtles are a reflection of the darker aspects of its history. The plantation's connection to the institution of slavery adds another layer of complexity to its haunted legacy. The presence of enslaved people on the plantation, including the figure of Chloe, serves as a reminder of the pain and suffering that occurred on the land. The hauntings at the Myrtles are not just about eerie occurrences and ghostly figures. They are about reckoning with the difficult truths of the past. Many believe that the spirits who remain at the Myrtles are not simply trapped between worlds, but are symbolic of the unresolved trauma and loss that the plantation witnessed over the centuries. For visitors, this connection between history and the paranormal makes the Myrtles plantation an especially compelling and thought-provoking place. It's not just about seeing a ghost. It's about experiencing a space where the past feels alive and where history is not easily forgotten. The spirits that reportedly haunt the plantation serve as reminders of the lives once lived there, lives filled with both beauty and tragedy, hope and despair. As the years go by, the Myrtles plantation's haunted reputation only seems to grow. Each new generation brings with it more visitors, more ghost hunters, and more believers eager to experience the supernatural for themselves. The plantation's enduring mystery, its ability to capture the imagination of those who visit, ensures that its ghost stories will continue to be told for years to come. Whether the hauntings at the Myrtles are the result of restless spirits, the lingering energy of the past, or simply the power of suggestion, one thing is clear. The Myrtles plantation has carved out a unique place in both history and folklore. It remains a place where the line between the real and the unreal, the past and the present, is blurred. A place where the living and the dead seem to coexist, if only for a fleeting moment. To those who believe, the Myrtles offers a rare glimpse into the world beyond, a chance to walk among ghosts and confront the unknown. And for those who leave unconvinced, it remains a beautiful, if eerie, reminder of the South's rich and complicated history. In either case, the Myrtles plantation continues to cast its spell on all who enter, ensuring that its haunted legacy will live on. The Bell family lived a quiet and peaceful life in the rural countryside of Adams, Tennessee, in the early 19th century. John Bell, the patriarch, was a well-respected farmer who had moved to the area with his wife, Lucy, and their children, hoping to build a prosperous and serene life. Their farmhouse, nestled among sprawling fields and towering trees, seemed like the perfect place to raise a family. Little did they know, something far darker lurked beneath the calm surface of their lives. It was in 1817 when strange things began to occur on the Bell property. At first, the signs were subtle and easy to dismiss. John would occasionally see odd animals wandering near the edges of his fields, creatures he couldn't quite identify, their forms shifting and unnatural. He spotted what looked like a large dog with a rabbit's head, and another time, a bird too large for the region perched in a tree. These sightings left him uneasy, but he chalked them up to tricks of the mind, refusing to believe anything was truly wrong. Soon, however, the strange events escalated beyond harmless wildlife. The first real sign of trouble came when John Bell began hearing odd sounds around the farmhouse. At night, the walls creaked and groaned in ways that didn't seem natural, like the wood itself was trying to speak. The noise of knocking echoed through the rooms, and sometimes it seemed like chains were being dragged across the floor, though nothing was ever found out of place. It wasn't long before the rest of the family began to notice these sounds as well. The Bell children, especially young Betsy, started waking up terrified, claiming they heard faint whispering in their ears while they slept. Lucy Bell, though skeptical at first, could no longer deny that something was very wrong when she too began hearing unexplained sounds, as though someone or something was watching them from just beyond their sight. One evening, as the family sat around their dinner table, a loud, sharp knock came from the front door. John, thinking it might be a late visitor or a neighbor in need, got up to answer it, only to find no one there. The knock came again, this time from the back door, but once again, there was no one in sight. The third knock came from inside the house itself. The family sat frozen in fear, unable to explain how this could be happening. They had begun to realize that something far more sinister than a prank was at play. Over the next few days, the haunting sounds grew louder and more frequent. It was as though the house had come alive with a presence that couldn't be seen, but was undeniably there. The walls echoed with strange voices, doors creaked open and shut on their own, and footsteps could be heard pacing through empty rooms. Yet, whenever the family tried to investigate, they found nothing. It was as though an invisible force had taken up residence in their home, and it wasn't going to leave anytime soon. John Bell, being a man of faith and reason, sought to keep his family calm, reassuring them that there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps it was the wind or some natural phenomena, but deep down, he knew better. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and no amount of reason could explain away the growing terror they felt each night. Despite his outward calm, he couldn't shake the creeping fear that this presence had come for him. Specifically, the once tranquil Bell home had become a place of dread. No longer able to ignore the strange happenings, John confided in a close neighbor, seeking advice on what to do. But the neighbor had no solutions. Word began to spread in the small community that the Bell family was experiencing something otherworldly, though few believed it at first. After all, who would believe that a house could be haunted by something invisible, something so relentless and violent? The days passed, but the entity showed no sign of leaving. The family could no longer sleep through the night, as the knocking, the scratching sounds, and the heavy footsteps never ceased. It was as if the entity wanted them to know it was always there, lurking just beyond the edge of their understanding, waiting for something darker yet to come. As the weeks wore on, the Bell family found themselves slipping into a state of constant fear and exhaustion. They had no idea what the entity wanted, but they knew it wasn't going to leave on its own. Whatever this presence was, it had taken root in their home, and they were helpless to stop it. The Bell Witch had arrived, and the nightmare was only beginning. As the days turned into weeks, the Bell family's quiet farmhouse became a place of escalating fear and confusion. What had begun as strange noises and eerie disturbances quickly transformed into something far more aggressive. It seemed the entity, whatever it was growing stronger. No longer content with simply haunting the house, it began to physically target the family, with a particular focus on John Bell and his young daughter, Betsy. The first signs of the entity's more dangerous nature emerged when Betsy started to experience strange sensations at night. At first, it felt like gentle taps on her skin, like someone lightly flicking her arm. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was nothing more than her imagination. But soon, these sensations grew into something much more alarming. She would wake up in the middle of the night to the feeling of her hair being yanked, her bed covers ripped off, or an invisible hand slapping her face. These attacks left her terrified and helpless, but they were just the beginning. As Betsy's torment grew, so did the malevolent presence in the house. Objects that once sat quietly on shelves would now fly across the room without warning, smashing into walls or crashing to the floor. Chairs would tip over by themselves, and dishes would shatter for no apparent reason. The invisible force seemed to revel in causing chaos, as if it found joy in making the Bell family live in constant fear. John Bell, too, was not spared from the entity's wrath. One morning, as he was working in the fields, he felt a sudden sharp pain in his face, as though he had been struck by an unseen hand. He stumbled, clutching his cheek, but when he looked around, there was no one there. This mysterious attack repeated itself several times over the coming weeks. John would be walking through his home or tending to his land when, without warning, he would feel the sting of an invisible force hitting him. Sometimes it was a slap, other times a violent push that nearly knocked him off his feet. The relentless torment began to take its toll on the entire family. Betsy, once a bright and lively girl, became withdrawn and fearful. She spent her days in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing when the next attack would come. Her schoolwork suffered, and she became too frightened to sleep alone at night, often seeking comfort in her parents' room. The stress weighed heavily on John and Lucy Bell as well, as they watched their daughter suffer and felt powerless to stop it. Despite their growing desperation, the Bell family tried to maintain some sense of normalcy. They continued their daily routines, farming, cooking, and tending to the household, hoping that by ignoring the entity, it might go away. But the more they ignored it, the more aggressive it seemed to become. The Bell children, especially Betsy, were often targeted while they slept. On one particularly terrifying night, Betsy awoke to find herself being lifted from her bed by an unseen force. She screamed in terror, and her parents rushed to her room, only to find her suspended in midair, her body thrashing as if being held by an invisible grip. As soon as John and Lucy entered the room, Betsy was dropped back onto her bed, gasping for breath and trembling with fear. There was no explanation for what had just happened, no way to rationalize the nightmare their daughter was living through. The attacks didn't stop with Betsy. Other members of the household also began experiencing physical assaults. Knocks and slaps came out of nowhere, leaving bruises and welts on their skin. The Bell family soon realized that they were dealing with a force beyond their understanding, one that was not only malicious, but intelligent. It seemed to know exactly when and how to strike, always leaving them on edge, waiting for the next act of violence. Word of the Bell family's plight began to spread throughout the community. Neighbors who visited the house witnessed the strange occurrences for themselves, objects moving on their own, doors slamming shut, and the eerie sounds of whispering voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Some locals believed the family had fallen victim to a powerful curse, while others thought they were dealing with an angry spirit seeking revenge for some past wrong. As the entity's attacks grew more frequent and more violent, the family became desperate for answers. John Bell turned to friends and neighbors for help, hoping that someone might know how to rid their home of the invisible force. But no one had any solutions. Ministers and pastors were called in to pray over the house, but even their spiritual guidance couldn't stop the torment. The Bell family began to lose hope, feeling as though they were trapped in a nightmare with no way out. The Bell Witch, as the entity had now come to be called, was relentless. It seemed to feed off the family's fear and suffering, growing more powerful with each passing day. John Bell, in particular, seemed to be the primary target. His health began to deteriorate as the constant stress and fear took a toll on his body. His once strong frame became frail, and his hands shook with anxiety. It was clear that the entity wanted something, but what it wanted remained a mystery. Despite the family's efforts to resist, they were losing their battle against the unseen force. The Bell Witch had made its intentions clear. It wasn't going to leave until it had finished whatever dark mission it had come to carry out. And as the attacks on Betsy and John grew more intense, the family couldn't help but wonder if they would survive the ordeal. The torment had already reached unbearable heights for the Bell family, but they were about to discover that the entity haunting their home was far more terrifying than they ever imagined. What had begun as an invisible, violent presence soon revealed itself to be something that could speak, something that could communicate with chilling clarity. It wasn't just a ghost or some mindless force. It was intelligent, cunning, and it had a voice. The first time the entity spoke, it caught the family completely off guard. They had grown used to the eerie knocks, disembodied footsteps, and the unsettling physical attacks. But when the family was sitting quietly one evening, bracing themselves for whatever might come next, a voice filled the room cold, clear, and unmistakably human. It came from nowhere and everywhere all at once, as if the very walls of the house were speaking. "I am here for John Bell," the voice said plainly. The family froze, staring at one another in disbelief. Was this some kind of cruel trick? But no, they all heard it. John Bell's face drained of color. Whatever this thing was, it had just declared that it was targeting him specifically. The air in the room seemed to thicken with dread as the voice continued, sometimes mocking, sometimes angry, but always clear in its hatred for John. The entity called itself Kate, though it later became widely known as the Bell Witch, and it made no secret of its intentions. The voice was unlike anything they had ever experienced before. It wasn't just random murmurs or whispers. It spoke in full sentences, as if it were a living person. It would ask questions, make demands, and even hold conversations with the family and their visitors. What made it even more terrifying was its depth of knowledge. Kate seemed to know things about the Bell family and their neighbors, secrets, events, and details that no one outside the family could have known. It could describe what was happening in other parts of town as if it had been there itself, watching and listening. The voice also seemed to enjoy tormenting Betsy. It would call her name in the dead of night, whisper cruel things in her ear, and laugh whenever she cried out in fear. It wasn't just content with physical attacks anymore. It wanted to break her spirit, to make her feel hopeless and afraid. The once bright and happy child was now a shadow of herself, living in constant fear of when the voice would speak again, what it would say, and what it would do. John Bell was another favorite target of the witch. Kate often berated him, insulting him, and claiming that it had come to end his life. It was as though the entity had a personal vendetta against him. The reasons were never entirely clear, though rumors swirled that Kate Batts, a neighbor with whom John had a falling out over a land deal, had cursed the Bell family out of spite. Whether or not this was true didn't seem to matter. The entity that called itself Kate seemed determined to fulfill its promise. The Bell family's friends and neighbors were initially skeptical of their claims about a talking spirit. But that changed quickly when word spread of the strange occurrences, and people began visiting the Bell household themselves to hear the voice. Ministers, curious locals, and even travelers from neighboring counties came to witness the phenomenon, and none left without being thoroughly shaken by what they experienced. The witch, it seemed, enjoyed the attention, often showing off its knowledge of distant events or entertaining visitors by speaking in different voices and tones. It could imitate the voice of anyone it chose. Sometimes it would even mimic the voices of the family themselves, causing confusion and fear. As the entity continued to speak, it became clear that this was more than just a haunting. It was something far more dangerous. The witch took pleasure in manipulating those around it, bending their will through fear, and taunting them with its knowledge and power. The Bell family tried to get help from local ministers, hoping that religious intervention might drive the entity away, but nothing worked. The prayers, the exorcisms, the blessings on the house, none of it made any difference. The voice persisted, as powerful and menacing as ever. And with each passing day, the witch's focus on John Bell grew more intense. It would mock him relentlessly, whispering threats and insults while he went about his daily life. His health, already fragile from the stress of living under such torment, began to deteriorate further. He would wake up in the middle of the night to find himself unable to move, his limbs heavy as though held down by an invisible force. He started suffering from unexplained seizures, his once strong and commanding presence reduced to that of a sickly and terrified man. Despite the terror it inflicted, the Bell Witch's voice wasn't always violent. It had moments of disturbing calm where it would engage in conversations, sometimes even laughing and joking with visitors. It seemed to enjoy playing with people's emotions, luring them into a false sense of security before turning on them with renewed ferocity. The voice was always unpredictable. One moment, it would be soft and friendly, and the next it would erupt in anger, hurling insults or making sinister threats. The most chilling aspect of the witch's communication was its promise. It had come to take John Bell's life, and it wouldn't stop until it had succeeded. The family was trapped in their own home, with no means of escape from the torment that had invaded every corner of their lives. Each day brought them closer to the grim reality that the witch might indeed be able to carry out its threat. By now, the Bell Witch was not just a local legend, but a phenomenon that had captured the attention of people far and wide. Visitors continued to flock to the Bell farm, seeking answers or hoping to experience the haunting for themselves. But for John Bell and his family, this was no spectacle. It was a living nightmare, and they were all too aware that the witch's promises were not idle threats. The Bell family had now come to understand the true nature of the entity they were dealing with. It wasn't just haunting them, it was targeting them, manipulating them, and working toward a single, terrifying goal. And as John Bell's health worsened, the family could only wait in dread, knowing that the worst was yet to come. As the witch's torment grew more relentless, it became clear that John Bell's days were numbered. The entity that had come to be known as the Bell Witch had made its intentions known from the start. It was determined to take John Bell's life, and now it seemed ready to fulfill that dark promise. Despite the Bell family's efforts to protect him, John's health was rapidly deteriorating, and there was little they could do to stop it. By late 1820, John had become a shadow of his former self. Once a strong and respected farmer, he was now a frail, weak man who could barely leave his bed. The constant stress and fear had taken a toll on him both physically and mentally, and the witch seemed to take delight in watching him waste away. His hands shook uncontrollably, and he struggled to speak or even move at times. The witch's attacks had become more personal, more direct, and more vicious as the weeks wore on. Each day brought new torments. The witch, with its unnerving voice, would whisper cruel taunts in John's ear, reminding him of its power over him. "Your time is near, John Bell," it would say, filling the room with a dark, ominous energy. Sometimes the voice would mock his weakness, laughing at his failing body, while other times it would grow angry. One evening, threatening, as the Bell family gathered in John's room, the witch's presence, the family could only watch in horror as John's condition worsened, thick and suffocating. John lay motionless, his breathing shallow and labored. He had been bedridden for days, and the once vibrant man was now barely recognizable. The room was tense with dread as the witch's voice filled the space again, speaking in low, menacing tones. It declared once more that it had come to end John's life, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The following morning, on December 20th, 1820, John Bell did not wake. Lucy, his wife, was the first to find him lying still in his bed. His breathing had become so faint that, at first, it seemed like he might still be alive. But as she approached, it became clear that he was slipping away. She called for the children, and soon the entire family gathered by John's side, praying for a miracle that would never come. In the midst of their grief, the witch's voice rang out again, cold and triumphant. "I did it. I finished what I came to do." The words hung heavy in the air, and the family was left in stunned silence. The witch had claimed responsibility for John Bell's death, just as it had promised it would. There was no mistaking it now. The entity had carried out its grim mission. The cause of John's sudden decline and death had remained a mystery, but in the days following his passing, the family discovered something chilling. Among John's medicine bottles, they found one that contained a strange, unidentified liquid. No one in the family recognized it, and it hadn't been prescribed by the doctor. Desperate for answers, they tested the substance by giving a small amount to the family's cat. Tragically, the animal didn't survive for long after consuming the liquid, confirming the family's worst fears. This mysterious substance had likely been used to poison John Bell. When confronted with this discovery, the witch's voice erupted in gleeful laughter. "I gave him that potion," it proclaimed, reveling in its victory. There was no longer any doubt that the Bell Witch had been responsible for John's death, using the strange liquid to carry out its fatal plan. It was a devastating realization for the Bell family, who had fought so hard to protect John, only to lose him to the very force they had feared for so long. As the Bell family prepared for John's funeral, the witch continued its disturbing behavior. During the solemn event, while friends and neighbors gathered to pay their respects, the entity made its presence known in a horrifying display. The witch's voice interrupted the proceedings, mocking the mourners, laughing loudly, and making crude jokes at the expense of the grieving family. It was a final, cruel insult, adding a layer of humiliation to the pain and sorrow of John Bell's passing. The family was left devastated, unable to escape the reach of the entity, even in their time of mourning. The death of John Bell marked the culmination of the witch's campaign of terror. For years, the Bell family had endured unimaginable horrors, but now the entity had accomplished what it had set out to do from the very beginning. It had taken John's life, and it had done so with a sense of satisfaction and malicious pride. The family was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, unsure of what would happen next. Yet, as dark as things had become, the witch's influence over the Bell household began to wane after John's death. The violent attacks on Betsy grew less frequent, and the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the farm seemed to lift, if only slightly. The entity, it seemed, had fulfilled its purpose, and with John gone, its presence started to fade. Despite the diminishing torment, the Bell family could never truly move on from what had happened. The memory of John's suffering and the witch's cruel laughter haunted them, even as the physical manifestations of the haunting began to dissipate. For the Bell children, especially Betsy, the scars of those years would last a lifetime. John Bell's death left a mark not only on his family, but on the entire community. The story of the Bell Witch spread far beyond Adams, Tennessee. becoming a legend that would be passed down for generations. People from all over the country would hear the tale of the haunting of the vengeful witch who had taken the life of a man without ever being seen. Though the entity seemed to have accomplished its goal, the question of why it had chosen John Bell and what truly fueled its hatred remained a mystery, one that would linger long after the haunting had ended. In the wake of John Bell's death, the Bell family hoped that the terror that had gripped their home for so many years might finally be over. The Bell Witch, after all, had achieved its dark purpose. It had taken John's life, just as it had promised, and for a while, it seemed that the entity might finally leave them in peace. The violent attacks on Betsy subsided, and the eerie disturbances that had plagued their home began to fade. But even though the immediate threat had diminished, the shadow of the Bell Witch still loomed over the family, the farm, and the entire community. In the months following John Bell's death, the once bustling Bell farmhouse became a place of deep sorrow and quiet reflection. The family tried to rebuild their lives, but the emotional scars left by the witch's torment were too deep to heal easily. Betsy, in particular, had suffered immensely. The physical attacks she had endured were gone, but the emotional trauma lingered. She had been haunted, manipulated, and terrorized by an unseen force that seemed to take joy in her pain. Now, though the witch's voice had gone silent, Betsy was left to grapple with the overwhelming fear and sadness that had become a part of her life. Despite the relative calm that followed John's death, the Bell family couldn't shake the feeling that the witch's presence still lingered, watching and waiting. They continued to hear faint, disembodied whispers from time to time, though the voice was not as aggressive as it once was. It was as if the entity was reminding them that it hadn't truly left, that it still had power over them. For the Bell family, life would never return to the way it had been before the haunting began. The peace they had once known was gone, replaced by the weight of the tragedy they had endured. As time passed, Betsy tried to move forward with her life. She had been engaged to a young man named Joshua Gardner before the haunting escalated, but the strain of the witch's attacks had put their relationship on hold. The entity had made it clear that it disapproved of their union, taunting Betsy about her engagement, and even going so far as to threaten Joshua's life. Betsy had been forced to break off the engagement, fearing that the witch's wrath would bring more suffering to those she loved. Even after John Bell's death, Betsy remained hesitant to reconnect with Joshua. She had no way of knowing whether the witch would return if she reignited the relationship. The fear of bringing the entity back into her life was too great, and so she made the difficult decision to move on. Betsy eventually married another man, Richard Powell, a local school teacher who had been a long-time family friend. Though Powell was much older than Betsy, their marriage brought her some measure of stability, and together they left Adams, Tennessee, to start a new life away from the farm that had become a place of nightmares. For the rest of the Bell family, life continued quietly on the farm. Though the Bell Witch's direct attacks had ceased, the farm remained a source of fascination and fear for the local community. Neighbors and visitors would often talk about the haunting in hushed tones, wondering if the witch might one day return. The legend of the Bell Witch grew, spreading far beyond the small Tennessee town. People from neighboring states came to visit the farm, hoping to catch a glimpse of the paranormal activity that had once terrorized the Bell family. As the years went by, the story of the Bell Witch took on a life of its own. The tale of the vengeful entity that had tormented the Bell family and claimed the life of John Bell became a piece of local folklore, passed down from generation to generation. It was whispered around campfires, told in taverns, and shared among friends. Each retelling seemed to grow more fantastical, adding new details and layers to the story. Some claimed the witch was the spirit of a wronged woman. Others believed it was a demon sent to punish John Bell for some unknown sin. The true origin of the Bell Witch remained a mystery, one that no amount of speculation could solve. Despite the enduring fear surrounding the legend, the Bell family's descendants were able to live relatively peaceful lives after the events. Betsy and her husband lived out the rest of their days away from Adams, and though they could never fully escape the memory of the haunting, they managed to build a life free from the witch's influence. The Bell farm remained in the family for generations, though none who lived there ever experienced the same level of terror that John and Betsy had. However, the Bell Witch wasn't entirely gone. Several years after John Bell's death, the entity reportedly returned to the farm for a brief period. It made its presence known by speaking to members of the Bell family, though its tone was far less menacing than it had been during its original reign of terror. It seemed almost playful this time, offering cryptic messages and making predictions about the future. The witch claimed it would return again one day, though it gave no clear indication of when or why. After a short time, the voice disappeared once more, leaving the family in a state of unease. True to its word, the Bell Witch never fully faded from memory. Even though the farm grew quiet again and no further violent hauntings occurred, the legacy of the witch remained firmly entrenched in the town's history. Locals continued to speak of the Bell Witch in reverent tones, warning their children not to venture too close to the old Bell property after dark, for fear that the spirit might still be lingering, waiting for another chance to wreak havoc. The legend of the Bell Witch has endured for nearly 2 centuries, captivating the imagination of those who hear it. Skeptics have tried to explain away the events as superstition or mass hysteria, while believers hold fast to the notion that something truly supernatural took place on the Bell farm. The story has inspired countless books, articles, and even films, solidifying its place as one of America's most famous hauntings. To this day, visitors still come to Adams, Tennessee, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Bell Witch or to feel the lingering energy of the entity that once terrorized a family and captivated a nation. Whether they are true believers or merely curious thrill seekers, they all leave with a sense of unease, as if the witch's spirit still lingers in the shadows, watching, waiting for the right moment to return. For the Bell family, the memory of those years will never fade. The death of John Bell, the torment of Betsy, and the voice that haunted their every waking moment left a mark that time could never fully erase. Though the witch's physical presence may have waned, its legacy lives on, a chilling reminder of the power of the unknown and the horrors that sometimes lie just beyond the veil of the ordinary.